Tonight, we step into the shadows of history, where lost artifacts, vanished civilizations, and unsolved mysteries still whisper through time. Across deserts, oceans, and forgotten cities, the past holds secrets far stranger than we ever imagined. Stories of advanced machines that shouldn't exist, entire populations that disappeared without a trace, and ancient knowledge that feels impossibly ahead of its time. In this journey, we explore real, documented historical puzzles that remain unsolved even today, from disappearing armies and cryptic manuscripts to buried cities, impossible engineering, and artifacts that challenge everything we think we know about human history. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Beneath the surface of the sea, where light fades into a deep, shifting blue and silence presses in from every direction, there are places time seems to forget, places where the past does not decay in the way it does on land, but instead waits, preserved, hidden, and undisturbed until someone stumbles upon it again. In the spring of 1900, a group of sponge divers sailing near the small Greek island of Antikythera were forced to anchor during a storm, and as they waited for the weather to calm, one diver descended into the depths, hoping to search for sponges along the rocky seabed. But what he found instead was something far stranger, something that would quietly challenge everything we thought we understood about the ancient world. When he reached the ocean floor, about 50 meters below the surface, he expected to find the usual landscape of rocks and marine life, but instead he saw something that looked like a field of bodies, statues lying scattered across the seabed, their faces obscured by algae, their limbs broken, their forms frozen in eerie stillness, as if time itself had abandoned them there. When he returned to the surface, shaken and breathless, he described what he had seen as a cemetery of statues beneath the sea, and those words marked the beginning of one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made. Over the following months, divers returned to the site with support from the Greek Navy, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to recover the remains of an ancient shipwreck, a vessel that had sunk more than 2,000 years earlier, likely during a violent storm as it carried its cargo across the Mediterranean. From the depths, they brought up bronze statues, marble figures, jewelry, ceramics, coins, and fragments of what appeared to be a once luxurious cargo, objects that suggested the ship had been transporting valuable goods, possibly from the Greek world to Rome. But among all these treasures, there was one object that at first seemed completely unremarkable, a small, heavily corroded lump of bronze encrusted with marine deposits, cracked and fragmented, barely recognizable as anything more than debris. It was catalogued, stored, and largely ignored, just another artifact among many, until decades later, when someone finally looked at it more closely and realized that what lay inside this corroded mass was something no one had ever expected to find in an ancient shipwreck. When researchers began to examine the object using X-rays in the mid-20th century, they discovered that beneath its rough outer surface was a complex arrangement of interlocking gears, dozens of them, each one carefully shaped and positioned with a level of precision that seemed completely out of place for its time. As imaging technology improved, especially with the use of CT scans, more details began to emerge, revealing not just a few simple components, but an entire system, a tightly packed network of bronze gears, plates, and inscriptions, all working together in a way that suggested purpose, calculation, and design. The device, now known as the Antikythera mechanism, turned out to be something extraordinary, a machine built more than 2,000 years ago that could model the movements of the heavens. When scientists reconstructed its functions, they found that by turning a small hand crank, the mechanism could predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the phases of the moon, map the cycles of planets, and even indicate the timing of ancient athletic events like the Olympic Games, all through a system of gears whose ratios encoded complex astronomical knowledge. To understand just how unusual this was, it helps to consider what historians once believed about ancient technology. For a long time, it was assumed that mechanical devices of this complexity simply did not exist in the ancient world, that such intricate gear systems only began to appear in medieval Europe, more than 1,000 years later, with the development of clocks and early machinery. The Antikythera mechanism did not just challenge that assumption, it overturned it completely, forcing historians to reconsider what ancient engineers might have been capable of. The gears themselves were remarkably precise, some with teeth less than a millimeter apart, cut in a way that allowed them to mesh smoothly and reliably, something that would require not only advanced tools, but also a deep understanding of mathematics and geometry. The device contained at least 37 gears, arranged across multiple layers, with inscriptions in ancient Greek that described its functions and guided its use. These inscriptions, once deciphered, revealed that the mechanism was not a simple tool, but a sophisticated model of the cosmos, a way of representing the movements of celestial bodies through mechanical motion. It encoded cycles such as the Metonic cycle, which tracks the relationship between the solar year and lunar months over a period of 19 years, as well as the Saros cycle, used to predict eclipses, and the Callipic cycle, an even more refined correction of lunar and solar alignment. Each of these cycles required careful calculation and precise ratios, and yet here they were, embedded in bronze gears crafted more than 2 millennia ago. What makes this even more puzzling is that nothing else like it has ever been found. There are no earlier prototypes, no later copies, no clear lineage that connects it to other devices, and no surviving texts that describe its construction in detail. It appears suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed, astonishingly advanced, and then disappears just as suddenly, leaving behind no trace of the knowledge that produced it. This has led to a question that continues to linger around the mechanism, not just how it was built, but who built it, and whether it was part of a broader tradition that has been lost to time. Some scholars have suggested that it may be connected to the work of Archimedes, whose writings mention devices capable of modeling celestial movements, while others point to Hipparchus, known for his precise observations of the moon and stars, or to the intellectual environment of Library of Alexandria, where scientists, mathematicians, and engineers once gathered to exchange ideas and push the boundaries of knowledge. But these remain theories, fragments of possibility, rather than confirmed answers, because no direct evidence links any one individual or institution to the creation of the mechanism. As researchers studied the device more closely, they began to notice something else, something that made the mystery even deeper. The level of craftsmanship suggested that this was not an experimental object or a one-time invention, but rather the result of an established tradition, the kind of refinement that usually comes from generations of development, trial, and error, and accumulated knowledge. The gears were not crude or uneven, but carefully shaped and aligned. The inscriptions were detailed and informative, and the overall design was coherent and purposeful, all of which implied that the maker was working within a system of understanding that had already matured. And yet, if such a tradition existed, it has left almost no trace behind. No workshops, no tools, no other machines, no written manuals explaining the techniques, nothing that would normally accompany a technological breakthrough of this magnitude. It is as if the knowledge required to build the mechanism appeared briefly, reached a remarkable level of sophistication, and then vanished, leaving only this single artifact as evidence that it ever existed. Some researchers believe that this disappearance may be tied to the broader collapse of knowledge that occurred in the ancient world, as wars, fires, and the fall of empires destroyed libraries, disrupted communities, and scattered the people who carried these skills. The destruction of places like the Library of Alexandria may have erased not just texts, but entire traditions of thought and practice, knowledge that was never written down in full, but passed from teacher to student, from craftsman to apprentice, and lost when those chains were broken. Others suggest that the mechanism might represent a rare convergence of ideas, a moment when astronomy, mathematics, and craftsmanship came together in a way that was not easily sustained, a peak rather than a baseline, a glimpse of what was possible rather than what was common. But even this raises questions, because the precision and complexity of the device seem too refined to be the result of a single isolated effort. Modern engineers who have studied the mechanism often express a quiet sense of astonishment, not just at what it does, but at how well it does it, how smoothly the gears would have turned, how accurately it could model celestial cycles, how compactly all of this was assembled into a handheld device. Recreating it today requires advanced tools, careful measurements, and a deep understanding of both mechanics and astronomy, and yet someone managed to achieve all of this using the materials and methods available more than 2,000 years ago. It challenges a common assumption about the past, the idea that ancient people were limited by their lack of modern technology, that progress follows a simple upward path from primitive to advanced. The Antikythera mechanism suggests something more complicated, a history where knowledge can rise, fall, and disappear, where capabilities can be reached and then forgotten, where the past may contain achievements that do not fit neatly into our expectations. And perhaps that is what makes this object so compelling, not just its technical brilliance, but the way it invites us to reconsider what we think we know about human history. It is easy to look at the ancient world and see it as distant, simpler, less developed, but objects like this remind us that the people who lived then were just as curious, just as inventive, and perhaps in some cases just as capable as we are today, working with the tools they had, guided by ideas that we are only beginning to rediscover. The mechanism does not speak in words, but in gears and motion, in cycles and alignments, in the quiet precision of its design, and in doing so, it leaves us with a sense of wonder that is difficult to resolve. Because if such a device could be built once, what else might have been created and lost? What other knowledge might have existed briefly and then vanished, leaving behind no record except the faint possibility that it once was? The sea preserved this one machine long enough for us to find it again, to study it, to try to understand it, but it also reminds us of how much may still be hidden beneath the water, beneath the earth, or simply beyond our current understanding. And as we turn its gears in our minds, trying to trace the logic behind its design, to imagine the hands that crafted it, the minds that conceived it, we are left with a quiet, lingering question, one that echoes far beyond this single artifact and into the broader story of our past. What else did we forget? We leave behind a machine that could predict the heavens, to a piece of armor that feels almost too perfect to be ancient, buried beneath layers of soil in the rugged landscapes of the Balkans, where mountains rise sharply and rivers carve through stone. Archaeologists uncovered something that at first glance seemed simple, even ordinary, a bronze helmet, worn by time, slightly dented, its surface dulled by centuries underground. Yet, as it was carefully cleaned and studied, it began to reveal a level of craftsmanship that did not quite fit with what we expect from the ancient world. This was not a decorative object, nor an elaborate ceremonial piece covered in engravings or ornaments, but something far more subtle. A helmet shaped with such precision and balance that it raised questions not about who wore it, but about how it was made. Known today as a Greco-Illyrian helmet, this form of armor dates back nearly 3,000 years, emerging during a time when metallurgy was still developing, when tools were basic, furnaces were limited, and the understanding of materials was thought to be relatively simple compared to modern standards. And yet this helmet challenges that entire assumption. At first, its design appears minimal, lacking the dramatic crests of later Greek helmets or the intricate engravings of ceremonial armor. But that simplicity is deceptive, because beneath it lies an extraordinary level of control over metal, a mastery that becomes more apparent the closer one looks. The entire helmet was formed from a single sheet of bronze, shaped into a smooth, continuous shell without seams, without joins, without any indication that separate pieces were ever connected together, something that is far more difficult than it might seem, even with modern tools. To shape metal in this way requires not only force, but precision, the ability to stretch and compress the material without causing fractures, to maintain an even thickness throughout, to control the curvature so that it fits the human head comfortably while still providing protection, and to do all of this using techniques that leave no obvious marks behind. Modern blacksmiths, working with advanced equipment, can replicate similar forms, but it requires careful planning, controlled heating, and specialized tools designed for shaping metal evenly. Yet these ancient craftsmen were working with clay furnaces, charcoal fires, and hand tools, without thermometers, without standardized measurements, without the machinery that we rely on today. And still, the result is a helmet that feels almost modern in its execution. When researchers examined the surface of these helmets under magnification, they found something unexpected, or rather, something missing. There were no clear hammer marks, no irregularities that would suggest rough shaping, no evidence of patchwork or repair, only a smooth, consistent surface that reflected light in a way that hinted at deliberate finishing techniques, methods that went beyond simple shaping into the realm of refinement. The thickness of the bronze remained remarkably even across the entire structure, slightly thicker at the crown where impact would be greatest, gradually thinning toward the edges, a distribution that suggests an intuitive understanding of stress and force, not calculated through equations, but achieved through experience, through a kind of knowledge that is difficult to document because it exists in practice rather than theory. Even more intriguing was the composition of the metal itself. Bronze, as an alloy of copper and tin, can vary widely in its properties depending on the ratio of its components, and small changes in that ratio can affect strength, flexibility, and resistance to corrosion. When modern analysis was applied to these helmets, the results showed a consistency that was difficult to explain. The proportions of copper and tin were balanced in a way that produced a material both strong and resilient, capable of absorbing impact without cracking, and resistant to the kind of degradation that would normally affect objects buried for thousands of years. Achieving this balance requires control over the smelting process, the ability to regulate temperature, to remove impurities, and to combine metals in precise proportions. Yet in the ancient world, these processes were carried out using simple furnaces and visual cues, relying on color, sound, and experience rather than instruments. It raises the question of how such precision was maintained, whether these craftsmen had developed techniques that allowed them to achieve consistent results without the tools we consider essential, or whether there was a level of metallurgical understanding that has since been lost, replaced by methods that are more measurable but perhaps less intuitive. Some researchers have described this as a form of prehistoric metallurgical intelligence, a way of working with materials that does not rely on written formulas or standardized procedures, but on a deep familiarity with the behavior of metal, an ability to read subtle changes in color and texture, to sense when the material is ready to be shaped, to know how much force to apply and when to stop, a skill that develops over years of practice and is passed down through direct experience rather than documentation. This kind of knowledge is difficult to preserve because it depends on continuity, on the presence of teachers and apprentices, on the survival of traditions that can be disrupted by war, migration, or the simple passage of time. If those chains are broken, the knowledge does not remain as easily as written records might. It fades, leaving behind objects that hint at what was once known, but do not fully explain how it was achieved. The Greco-Illyrian helmets also present another layer of mystery in the techniques used to shape them. Some studies have suggested that the metal was worked using a process similar to rotational hammering, where the material is gradually formed by applying repeated, controlled blows in a circular motion, allowing the shape to emerge without creating sharp stress points. Others propose that softer tools, such as wooden or leather mallets, may have been used in combination with heating to gently compress the bronze, preserving its internal structure while guiding it into form. There are even traces on some helmets that resemble patterns produced by techniques similar to modern metal spinning, a process where metal is shaped over a form while being rotated, though there is no clear evidence that such a method existed in the ancient world in the way we understand it today. What is clear is that whatever methods were used, they were effective, producing results that have endured for thousands of years with minimal degradation. The helmets are not only structurally sound, but also remarkably lightweight, often weighing just over a kilogram, making them practical for use in combat or ceremonial contexts, depending on how they were intended. Some helmets show signs of wear, suggesting they were used in battle, while others appear almost untouched, found in burial sites alongside pottery and other artifacts, hinting at symbolic or ritual significance. In certain cases, small holes have been discovered near the edges, possibly used to attach linings or decorative elements, though their exact purpose remains uncertain. There are also markings on some helmets that do not correspond to known writing systems, patterns that repeat in ways that suggest meaning, but have not been fully interpreted, leaving open the possibility that these objects carried not just physical function, but cultural or spiritual significance as well. The distribution of these helmets across regions such as Greece, Albania, Montenegro, and Croatia adds another layer of complexity, as it suggests a network of production and exchange that is not fully understood. Were these helmets made in a central location and traded across regions, or were the techniques shared among different groups, each producing their own versions using similar methods? No large-scale workshops or foundries have been definitively identified, which is unusual for objects that required such skill to produce, leading some to speculate that the knowledge may have been closely guarded, passed down within small groups or families rather than spread widely. This would make it even more vulnerable to loss, as the disappearance of a few key individuals could mean the end of an entire tradition. Modern attempts to replicate these helmets using only ancient tools have had mixed results. While it is possible to create similar shapes, achieving the same level of uniformity, smoothness, and material balance has proven difficult, often requiring adjustments that rely on modern understanding rather than purely historical methods. This does not mean that the ancient craftsmen possessed tools beyond what we know, but it does suggest that their approach to working with materials may have been different, guided by principles that are not immediately obvious to us, or perhaps simply by a level of patience and attention that is hard to replicate in a world focused on efficiency and speed. The more these helmets are studied, the more they challenge the idea that technological progress is a straightforward path from simple to complex, instead suggesting that there are different ways of achieving sophistication, some of which may not leave behind clear records of how they were developed. It invites a reconsideration of what we mean when we describe ancient societies as primitive, a term that often reflects more about our assumptions than about their actual capabilities. These craftsmen were not working with advanced machines or digital tools, but they were working with knowledge, with experience, with a deep understanding of their materials, and with a level of skill that allowed them to create objects that still hold up under modern scrutiny. The helmet, in its quiet simplicity, becomes more than just a piece of armor. It becomes a window into a way of thinking, a way of interacting with the physical world that does not rely on the same frameworks we use today. It suggests that intelligence and innovation can take many forms, that progress is not always linear, and that there may be aspects of ancient knowledge that we have not fully recovered, not because they were lost in a dramatic event, but because they were never fully written down, never fully explained, existing instead in the hands and minds of those who practiced them. As we hold these helmets in museums, examining their curves, their surfaces, their subtle details, we are not just looking at artifacts, we are looking at the result of choices, of techniques, of traditions that once made perfect sense to the people who created them, but now appear almost mysterious to us. And in that gap between what we see and what we understand, there is a quiet reminder that the past may still have more to teach us, not just about what was made, but about how it was made and why it seems so difficult for us to do the same in exactly the same way. We leave behind metal shaped beyond its time, to stone carved so perfectly it seems to defy nature itself. Deep within the humid jungles of Mesoamerica, where thick roots twist through ancient ruins and the air carries the quiet weight of centuries, archaeologists uncovered objects that did not immediately reveal their full mystery. Fragments of green stone, smooth, cold, and faintly luminous even under layers of soil, pieces that at first seemed decorative, perhaps ceremonial, until they were carefully cleaned, studied, and slowly reassembled into something far more striking. Faces, human faces, formed from dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individual pieces of jade, each one cut, shaped, and placed with such precision that the seams between them were nearly invisible, creating a surface so continuous and reflective that it resembled polished glass rather than carved stone. These were the jade masks of the Maya, funerary objects placed over the faces of rulers and elites, intended not just to honor the dead, but to transform them, to give them a new face for the journey beyond life, a face that would endure, that would not decay, that would carry the essence of the person into eternity. Jade, the material from which these masks were made, is not an easy substance to work with. It is one of the toughest natural materials known, not because it is the hardest in terms of scratch resistance, but because of its internal structure, a dense interlocking network of crystals that makes it incredibly resistant to breaking, chipping, or cutting. On the Mohs scale, jadeite ranks around 6.5 to 7, similar to quartz, but its toughness makes it far more difficult to shape than many harder materials. Even with modern tools, cutting jade requires diamond-tipped equipment, controlled pressure, and careful handling to avoid damaging the stone. And yet, thousands of years ago, the Maya managed to transform this stubborn material into thin, delicate pieces, each one shaped with edges so precise and surfaces so smooth that they fit together seamlessly, forming masks that capture the contours of the human face with remarkable accuracy. What makes this even more intriguing is that the Maya did not have access to metal tools in the way we understand them today. They worked primarily with stone, wood, and other natural materials, using techniques that relied on abrasion rather than cutting, grinding the jade with harder substances, possibly quartz sand or other minerals, slowly wearing it down over time. This process is incredibly slow, requiring patience and consistency, and even then, achieving a smooth, reflective finish is difficult, as the surface tends to remain slightly uneven, marked by the gradual removal of material. Yet the jade masks tell a different story, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen, their edges clean and consistent, their pieces aligned so perfectly that light passes across them without interruption, as if the entire mask were carved from a single piece rather than assembled from many. One of the most famous examples is the funerary mask of the Maya ruler known as Kainich Janab Pakal, often referred to as Pakal the Great, discovered in the tomb at Palenque, where the mask lay over his face surrounded by offerings, beads, and other objects meant to accompany him into the afterlife. This mask is composed of more than 200 individual pieces of jade, each one shaped to match a specific part of the face, the curve of the cheek, the bridge of the nose, the outline of the lips, the sockets of the eyes, all coming together in a way that feels almost organic, as if the stone itself had grown into that form rather than being forced into it. The eyes are often inlaid with materials like shell or obsidian, adding contrast and depth, while the overall composition maintains a balance that suggests not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of proportion and form. When modern researchers attempt to replicate these masks using only the tools and materials believed to have been available at the time, they encounter significant challenges. Grinding jade into precise shapes without causing fractures requires careful control, and achieving a high level of polish takes an enormous amount of time, often resulting in surfaces that still lack the uniform smoothness seen in the original artifacts. The joints between pieces are particularly difficult to replicate, as even slight variations in shape or alignment can create visible gaps. Yet in the ancient masks, these joints are often so fine that they are difficult to detect without magnification. This has led some researchers to question whether the techniques we assume were used are the only ones that were available, or whether there might have been methods that have not been fully understood or documented. Some theories suggest that the Maya may have used a combination of abrasive materials and controlled pressure to gradually shape the jade, possibly using tools made from harder stones or even organic materials that could conform to the surface as it was being worked. Others propose that the polishing process may have involved the use of fine powders combined with water or other liquids to create a slurry that could smooth the surface over time, though this still does not fully explain the level of finish achieved. There are also more speculative ideas, suggesting that the Maya might have understood certain properties of the stone that allowed them to work it more effectively, perhaps through controlled heating, vibration, or other processes that altered its structure in subtle ways. While these ideas remain unproven, they reflect the difficulty in explaining how such results were achieved using only the methods we currently recognize. Beyond the technical aspects, the jade masks also carry deep cultural and symbolic meaning. For the Maya, jade was not just a material, but a substance associated with life, breath, and renewal. Its green color linked to vegetation, growth, and the continuation of existence. Placing a jade mask over the face of the deceased was a way of preserving identity, of ensuring that the person could be recognized in the afterlife, and of connecting them to the cycles of nature and the cosmos. Small pieces of jade were sometimes placed in the mouth of the dead, symbolizing breath or spirit, reinforcing the idea that jade was a medium through which life could be sustained beyond physical death. The masks themselves were not generic, but often tailored to the individual, reflecting their status, their identity, and their place within the social and spiritual structure of their society. This combination of technical precision and symbolic depth makes the masks particularly compelling, as they are not just objects of craftsmanship, but expressions of belief, of a worldview in which materials, forms, and meanings are closely intertwined. The more closely these masks are studied, the more they seem to blur the line between art and engineering, between ritual and technique, suggesting that the people who created them did not see these categories as separate, but as part of a unified approach to understanding and shaping the world around them. The idea that the Maya might have approached materials differently, not just in terms of tools, but in terms of perception, becomes more plausible when we consider how much of their knowledge was embedded in practice rather than written down. Without extensive written records describing their methods, we are left to infer their techniques from the objects themselves, to reverse engineer their processes based on the results they achieved. This can be challenging because it requires us to think not just about what they did, but how they thought, how they observed materials, how they experimented, how they passed knowledge from one generation to the next. It is possible that their approach involved a level of patience and attention that is difficult to replicate in a modern context, where efficiency often takes priority over process, and where tools are designed to minimize the need for direct interaction with the material. In contrast, the creation of these masks would have required sustained engagement, a continuous feedback loop between the craftsman and the stone, where each movement, each adjustment, was guided by observation and experience rather than by fixed measurements. This kind of interaction can lead to results that are highly refined, but also difficult to standardize or reproduce without the same level of immersion. As we look at these masks today, displayed in museums, carefully lit to highlight their surfaces, their colors, their forms, it is easy to focus on their beauty, their aesthetic qualities, but beneath that surface lies a deeper question, one that extends beyond the objects themselves and into our understanding of the past. How did they achieve this level of precision without the tools we consider necessary? And what does that say about the ways in which knowledge can be developed and applied? The masks do not provide a clear answer, but they do offer a perspective, a reminder that technological capability is not defined solely by the presence of certain tools, but by the relationship between people and materials, by the ways in which knowledge is acquired, shared, and refined over time. They suggest that there may be forms of understanding that do not fit neatly into our current frameworks, that exist outside of written records and formal systems, and that can be lost just as easily as they are gained. In this sense, the jade masks are not just artifacts of a distant culture, but invitations to reconsider our assumptions, to recognize that the past may hold insights that are not immediately visible, and that the boundaries of what is possible are often shaped by the limits of our own perspective. As light moves across the surface of a jade mask, reflecting softly, revealing its contours, its subtle variations in color, its seamless construction, there is a quiet sense that we are looking at something more than the sum of its parts, something that carries within it a knowledge we have not fully recovered, a way of working with the world that feels both familiar and distant at the same time. And in that moment, as we try to understand how stone could be shaped with such precision, how it could be made to appear almost fluid, almost alive, we are left with a question that lingers just beneath the surface, simple in its wording, but difficult to answer. Did they shape matter differently? We leave behind faces carved from stone to cities that were simply left behind. Across the vast plains of the northwestern Indian subcontinent, where rivers once flowed wide and steady, and the land supported some of the earliest urban centers in human history, there are ruins that do not tell a story of destruction, but of silence. Places where streets still lie in careful alignment, where walls stand in quiet order, where drainage systems remain astonishingly intact, and yet no voices echo through them anymore. No signs of struggle, no evidence of collapse in the way we usually understand it, only the lingering presence of a civilization that seemed to step away from itself. This was the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the great early societies of the ancient world, contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet in many ways distinct, defined not by monumental temples or grand palaces, but by a remarkable sense of order, planning, and balance that still feels striking even today. At sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, archaeologists uncovered cities that seemed almost modern in their layout, with grid-based streets intersecting at right angles, standardized brick sizes used across vast regions, and sophisticated drainage systems that carried wastewater away from homes through covered channels, suggesting a level of civic organization that was not only advanced, but widely shared. Houses were built with private wells, bathrooms, and access to these drainage systems, indicating a concern for hygiene and urban living that stands out even among other ancient civilizations. There were granaries for storing food, workshops for crafting goods, and evidence of long-distance trade connecting these cities to regions as far as Mesopotamia. Yet despite all this complexity, There is a striking absence of certain features we might expect, no clear signs of centralized royal authority, no massive monuments glorifying individual rulers, no large-scale depictions of warfare or conquest. Instead, what we see is a society that appears to have functioned through a different kind of organization, one that emphasized uniformity and cooperation rather than hierarchy and display. And then, sometime around 1900 BCE, something changed. The cities that had once been vibrant centers of activity began to empty, not suddenly, not in a way that suggests a single catastrophic event, but gradually, steadily, as if the rhythm of life that had sustained them for centuries began to fade. Buildings were left behind, sometimes with objects still inside, tools, pottery, everyday items that suggest people did not leave in panic, but neither did they return. The streets that had once been carefully maintained began to show signs of neglect, drainage systems clogged or left unrepaired, structures collapsing slowly over time rather than being destroyed in conflict. What makes this particularly unsettling is what is not found in these sites. There are no widespread signs of violence, no mass graves indicating large-scale warfare, no layers of ash that would point to destruction by fire, no clear evidence of invasion or conquest that could explain the disappearance of such a vast and organized civilization. This absence of evidence does not make the mystery simpler, but more complex, because it removes the explanations we might instinctively reach for, leaving behind a question that feels harder to answer precisely because it lacks the drama we often associate with the fall of civilizations. One of the most widely discussed possibilities is environmental change, particularly the shifting of river systems that once supported these cities. The Indus Valley civilization depended heavily on rivers for water, agriculture, and trade, and there is evidence to suggest that some of these rivers, including the Gaga-Hakra system, may have changed course or dried up over time, reducing the availability of water and making it more difficult to sustain large urban populations. Climate change may have played a role as well, with periods of drought affecting crop yields and altering the balance that had allowed these cities to thrive. These changes would not necessarily have caused immediate collapse, but could have gradually undermined the foundations of urban life, encouraging people to move towards smaller settlements or regions where conditions were more stable. This kind of transition would leave behind the kind of archaeological record we see, not one of destruction, but of abandonment, of a slow shift away from urban centers toward a different way of living. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for everything. The level of organization and standardization seen across the Indus Valley suggests a system that was deeply integrated, one that could potentially adapt to changing conditions. And while environmental stress might explain the decline of large cities, it does not necessarily explain the near complete disappearance of the cultural markers that define this civilization. Another possibility is that social or economic changes altered the structure of society in ways that made large urban centers less viable, perhaps shifting trade routes, changes in production, or internal transformations that led to decentralization. But again, the evidence for such shifts is indirect, inferred rather than clearly documented, because one of the most significant challenges in understanding the Indus Valley civilization is that its script, found on seals and other artifacts, remains undeciphered. Without the ability to read their written language, we are missing a direct window into their thoughts, their records, their explanations of events, leaving us to piece together their story through physical remains rather than words. This absence of written clarity adds another layer of silence to the mystery, as if the civilization itself has left behind only fragments of its voice, enough to suggest complexity, but not enough to fully explain it. The seals themselves, small carved objects often depicting animals, symbols, and short sequences of script, hint at a system of communication that was likely widespread and standardized. Yet despite decades of study, no definitive interpretation has been agreed upon. This means that we do not know what these people called themselves. how they described their cities, their beliefs, their experiences of the changes that eventually led to their decline. We do not have their accounts of droughts or migrations, of challenges or decisions, only the physical traces of their lives and the spaces they left behind. In some areas, there is evidence that smaller settlements continued after the decline of the major cities, suggesting that the people themselves did not disappear entirely, but rather dispersed, integrating into different regions, adapting to new conditions, perhaps losing some aspects of their shared identity in the process. This kind of transformation is more difficult to detect archaeologically because it does not leave behind the dramatic markers of collapse, but instead blends into the broader patterns of human movement and change. It raises the possibility that the Indus Valley civilization did not end in a single moment, but gradually dissolved, its people continuing in different forms, its knowledge and practices absorbed into other cultures, its distinct identity fading over time rather than being abruptly erased. And yet, when we stand in the ruins of these cities today, there is a sense of something more than gradual change, a feeling of absence that is hard to ignore, because the cities themselves remain so complete in their structure, so clearly designed for a kind of life that is no longer present. The straight streets, the uniform bricks, the carefully planned drainage systems all speak of intention, of a vision of how a city should function, and the fact that these elements remain while the people are gone creates a contrast that feels almost unnatural, as if the stage has been set, but the actors have left. This is what makes a quiet disappearance so unsettling, not the presence of destruction, but the absence of explanation, the sense that something significant has happened without leaving behind the kind of evidence we expect. It challenges the way we think about history, which often relies on clear events, battles, disasters, turning points that can be identified and described, because here we have a civilization that seems to have slipped away without a single defining moment, leaving behind a puzzle that is composed as much of what is missing as of what remains. As researchers continue to study these sites, using new technologies to analyze soil, climate patterns, and settlement distribution, more details may emerge, new connections may be made, but it is possible that some aspects of this mystery will remain unresolved, not because the answers do not exist, but because they are no longer accessible in a direct way. The Indus Valley civilization reminds us that not all endings are dramatic, that some are quiet, gradual, and difficult to trace, and that these kinds of endings can be just as profound, if not more so, because they leave us with questions that do not have clear boundaries. They invite us to consider the fragility of complex systems, the ways in which environmental, social, and cultural factors can interact over time to reshape human societies, often without a single cause that can be isolated and named. And as we look at these ancient cities, preserved in their layout, their materials, their subtle details, we are confronted with a kind of silence that is not empty, but full of possibility, of interpretations, of theories that try to bridge the gap between what we see and what we understand. In that silence, there is a reminder that history is not always a story of rise and fall, marked by clear events, but sometimes a process of change that unfolds slowly, leaving behind traces that are both revealing and incomplete. The people who built these cities lived, worked, traded, and interacted in ways that created a stable and organized world. And then, for reasons we are still trying to understand, that world shifted, and they moved on, leaving behind the structures, but not the continuity. It is this combination of presence and absence, of clarity in design and uncertainty in outcome, that gives the Indus Valley its particular kind of mystery, one that does not rely on dramatic ruins or catastrophic endings, but on the quiet, enduring question of how something so well ordered could simply fade away, and what that might mean for the ways we understand our own civilizations today. We leave behind a civilization that vanished silently, to a tomb that challenges everything we thought we knew about power in the ancient world. In the dry expanse of Upper Egypt, where the desert stretches endlessly and the horizon seems unchanged for thousands of years, lies one of the oldest burial grounds of early kings, a place where the first rulers of a newly unified land were laid to rest, their tombs built not yet in towering stone, but in carefully constructed chambers beneath the earth, surrounded by offerings, symbols, and the quiet weight of belief. It was here, at Abydos, that archaeologists uncovered something unexpected, a tomb that at first seemed to belong among kings in both scale and structure, yet the name associated with it did not match the pattern that history had long assumed. The inscriptions pointed to a figure known as Mernith, a name that appears in the earliest dynastic records, a name that carries within it a connection to one of Egypt's most ancient and powerful deities, Neith, the goddess of creation, war, and weaving, often described as the one who existed before all else, the one who gave birth to the gods themselves. The name Merneith translates roughly to beloved of Neith, but in a culture where names were rarely casual, where they reflected identity, role, and divine association, this connection suggests something deeper, something that goes beyond a simple title. What makes this discovery particularly striking is not just the name, but the nature of the tomb itself. Merneith's burial complex is not modest, not secondary, not hidden in the margins of royal history, but positioned among the tombs of kings, constructed with a scale and organization that mirrors the burials of male rulers of the first dynasty. The central chamber is surrounded by dozens of subsidiary graves, smaller tombs arranged in a pattern that suggests intentional design, each one containing the remains of individuals who appear to have been buried at the same time as the primary occupant. This arrangement has led researchers to conclude that these were likely retainers, servants, or attendants who were sacrificed or otherwise interred to accompany the central figure into the afterlife, a practice that appears in early dynastic Egypt, though rarely on this scale. The presence of these graves, numbering more than 40 in some estimates, indicates not just status, but authority, the kind of authority that could command such a ritual, that could define not only the life of a ruler, but the fate of others beyond death. Inside the tomb, artifacts were found that further complicate the picture: seal impressions bearing Merneith's name, objects associated with administration and governance, items that suggest not just ceremonial importance, but active involvement in the functioning of the state. In some cases, her name appears alongside those of recognized kings, not in a secondary position, but in a way that implies equivalence, or at least proximity to power that is difficult to dismiss. This has led to a long-standing debate among historians and Egyptologists, a question that does not have a simple answer: whether Merneith was merely the mother of a king, acting as a regent during a period of transition, or whether she was, in fact, a ruler in her own right, perhaps the first female pharaoh in Egyptian history, predating more widely recognized figures like Hatshepsut by more than 1,000 years. The evidence does not settle easily into either interpretation, because while some records refer to her in ways that suggest a supportive role, others elevate her status to something closer to sovereignty. The lack of a clear, consistent narrative is partly due to the fragmentary nature of early Egyptian records, where inscriptions are limited, symbols carry layered meanings, and later interpretations may have been influenced by cultural shifts that favored male rulership. It is possible that her role was deliberately minimized or reinterpreted over time, her presence preserved in physical form through her tomb, but obscured in the written record by those who came after. Beyond the question of political authority, there is another layer to this mystery, one that moves into the realm of belief and symbolism. The association with the goddess Neith is not incidental, as Neith was one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, a figure who embodied both creation and destruction, who was linked to the weaving of the cosmos itself, to the idea that reality was something structured, patterned, brought into being through divine intention. In some traditions, Neith is described as self-created, existing before the emergence of the world, a source of both order and power. To be beloved of Neith could imply favor, protection, or alignment with this divine force, but in certain interpretations, it might suggest something more direct, a form of embodiment, a role that blurs the line between human and divine. This idea is not entirely foreign to ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were often seen as living gods, intermediaries between the human world and the divine. But the possibility that Mer-Neith occupied such a role challenges the assumption that this status was exclusively male in the earliest periods. The layout of her tomb adds to this sense of deliberate symbolism. The arrangement of chambers, the placement of offerings, the orientation of structures all suggest a careful integration of architectural design with cosmological beliefs. Some researchers have noted alignments that correspond to celestial points, connections between the physical structure of the tomb and the broader understanding of the universe as it was conceived at the time. The presence of storage areas containing jars, possibly for food and drink, indicates preparation for an afterlife that was not abstract but tangible, a continuation of existence that required sustenance, protection, and order. The inclusion of wine storage, with residues that have been analyzed to reveal complex mixtures of grapes, herbs, and resins, points to a level of sophistication in both production and ritual use, suggesting that these offerings were not merely symbolic, but carefully prepared elements of a larger system of belief. The idea that dozens of individuals were buried alongside Mer-Neith, whether through sacrifice or other means, raises questions about the nature of loyalty, obligation, and power in this early society. These were not random inclusions, but part of a structured practice, one that reflects a worldview in which the ruler's journey into the afterlife was not solitary, but accompanied, supported by those who had served in life. It suggests a form of authority that extended beyond death, where the social hierarchy of the living was replicated in the realm of the dead, reinforcing the continuity of order across different states of existence. This kind of practice is difficult to fully understand from a modern perspective, as it involves values and beliefs that are far removed from contemporary norms. But within its context, it represents a coherent system, one in which the boundaries between life, death, and divinity were interconnected. The absence of detailed written records about Mer-Neith's reign, if it can be called that, leaves much of her story open to interpretation. Later, king lists, compiled in subsequent dynasties, do not consistently include her as a ruler, and this omission has been interpreted in different ways, either as evidence that she was not considered a pharaoh in the formal sense, or as an indication that her role was intentionally excluded or diminished. The process of historical recording in ancient Egypt was not neutral. It was shaped by the priorities and perspectives of those in power at the time, and it is possible that figures who did not fit established patterns were reclassified or overlooked. This means that the absence of her name in certain records does not necessarily reflect her actual influence, but rather the way that influence was later framed. The physical evidence of her tomb, however, remains a structure that does not conform to the expectations of a secondary figure, but instead asserts a presence that is difficult to ignore. It stands as a reminder that history is not always a complete or consistent narrative, but a collection of fragments that must be interpreted, compared, and reconsidered as new information emerges. The question of whether Mer-Neith was a ruler, a regent, or something more symbolic is not just about classification, but about understanding the nature of power in a time when the lines between human authority and divine representation were closely intertwined. If she did rule, even temporarily, it suggests that the early Egyptian state was more flexible in its structure than later periods might indicate, allowing for forms of leadership that were not strictly defined by gender. If her role was more symbolic, tied to her association with Neith, it points to a system in which religious and political authority were deeply connected, where identity could be shaped by both lineage and belief, and if, as some more speculative theories suggest, her name and role represent not a single individual, but a title or position that may have been held by more than one person over time, then the tomb itself becomes a focal point for a broader tradition, a place where the concept of divine rulership was expressed through continuity rather than individuality. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive, and the truth may lie in a combination of factors that are difficult to separate with the evidence available. What remains clear is that Merneith occupies a unique position in the early history of Egypt, a figure who does not fit neatly into established categories, whose presence is both visible and elusive, defined by a tomb that speaks of power, complexity, and intention, but does not fully explain itself. As archaeologists continue to study the site, using new methods to analyze materials, structures, and contexts, more details may emerge, but it is likely that some aspects of her story will remain uncertain, not because they are beyond understanding, but because they belong to a system of thought that is different from our own, one in which identity, authority, and divinity are interwoven in ways that do not translate easily into modern terms. Standing at Abydos, looking at the remains of her tomb, one is struck not by the scale alone, but by the sense of presence, the idea that this was not just a burial, but a statement, a declaration of status that extended beyond life, into a realm where the boundaries between human and divine were deliberately blurred. It invites a question that does not have a simple answer, one that lingers in the space between what we know and what we can only infer, asking us to consider not just who Merneith was, but what she represented, and whether the categories we use to define her are sufficient to capture the reality of her role. Was she a ruler, or something more? We leave behind a queen who may have been divine, to entire civilizations hidden beneath forests we once believed were untouched. For centuries, the dense green canopies of Central and South America were seen as barriers, vast stretches of wilderness too hostile for large human societies to thrive, places where nature reigned uninterrupted, where the idea of cities, roads, and organized systems seemed unlikely beneath the tangled layers of trees and vines. Early explorers who moved through these regions often described them as endless, impenetrable jungles, environments that resisted settlement and erased any trace of human presence over time. And for a long time, that perception shaped the way historians and archaeologists understood these landscapes, as places where small, scattered communities might exist, but not the kind of complex, interconnected civilizations found in other parts of the ancient world. Yet in recent decades, that understanding has begun to shift, not gradually, but in a way that feels almost like the lifting of a veil, revealing patterns beneath the surface that were always there, but hidden from view. The turning point came with the use of a technology known as LiDAR, a method that uses laser pulses emitted from aircraft to map the ground below, penetrating the forest canopy and capturing the contours of the land with remarkable precision. When these scans were first applied to regions associated with the Maya, the results were unexpected, not because they showed isolated structures, but because they revealed entire landscapes shaped by human hands, vast networks of cities, roads, terraces, and reservoirs extending across areas that had long been considered untouched. What appeared from above as continuous forest turned out to be layered over a complex system of urban planning, where structures were not randomly placed, but organized according to patterns that suggest intention, coordination, and a deep understanding of both environment and design. At sites like Tikal and El Mirador, LiDAR mapping revealed not just the central pyramids and plazas that had already been excavated, but thousands of additional features, smaller buildings, causeways connecting distant locations, agricultural terraces carved into the landscape, and water management systems designed to collect and store rainwater in a region where seasonal variation made such planning essential. These were not isolated achievements, but part of a broader network, suggesting that the Maya world was far more densely populated and interconnected than previously believed, with infrastructure that supported millions of people over extended periods of time. The scale of these discoveries challenges the idea that the jungle was ever truly wild in the way it has often been imagined, because it suggests that much of what we see today as natural forest may in fact be the result of long-term interaction between humans and their environment, a landscape shaped not through domination, but through careful management and adaptation. This idea becomes even more compelling when we look beyond the Maya region and into the Amazon basin, a place that has long been considered one of the least likely locations for large, organized societies due to its soil conditions and ecological complexity. The prevailing assumption for much of the 20th century was that the Amazon could support only small, mobile groups, that its soils were too poor for sustained agriculture, and that any significant human presence would quickly be erased by the rapid growth of vegetation. But as research has expanded, particularly with the use of satellite imagery and archaeological surveys, a different picture has begun to emerge, one that parallels the findings in Mesoamerica in ways that are difficult to ignore. In parts of the Amazon, researchers have identified geometric earthworks, large-scale constructions in the form of circles, squares, and interconnected lines carved into the ground, often aligned with cardinal directions and arranged in patterns that suggest planning rather than randomness. These structures, known as geoglyphs, are not isolated features, but part of broader landscapes that include raised fields, canals, and settlements, all indicating a level of organization that contradicts earlier assumptions about the region. Perhaps even more striking is the discovery of a type of soil known as terra preta, or black earth, which is found in patches throughout the Amazon and is markedly different from the surrounding soil. Unlike the typically nutrient-poor soils of the rainforest, terra preta is rich, dark, and highly fertile, capable of supporting sustained agriculture over long periods without the need for modern fertilizers. Analysis of this soil has revealed that it is not a natural formation, but a product of human activity created through the deliberate addition of organic materials such as charcoal, bone, and plant matter, combined in ways that enhance its ability to retain nutrients and support plant growth. This process, which appears to have been developed thousands of years ago, represents a form of ecological engineering that is both sophisticated and sustainable, allowing for the cultivation of crops in an environment that would otherwise be challenging for agriculture. The existence of terra preta suggests that the people of the Amazon were not simply adapting to their environment, but actively shaping it, transforming the forest into a managed system that could support larger populations and more stable communities. When we consider these findings alongside the discoveries in the Maya region, a pattern begins to emerge, one that raises questions about the relationship between these distant areas and the possibility of shared ideas or parallel developments. Both regions show evidence of large-scale planning, of landscapes modified to support human life in ways that are integrated with natural systems rather than imposed upon them. Both reveal an understanding of water management, soil enhancement, and spatial organization that goes beyond what we might expect from societies operating without modern technology. And both challenge the narrative that complex civilizations are limited to certain geographic or environmental conditions, suggesting instead that human ingenuity can find ways to thrive in a wide range of settings, often by working with the environment rather than against it. This has led some researchers to propose more expansive theories, including the idea that there may have been connections between these regions that have not yet been fully documented, or that they may represent different expressions of a broader tradition of knowledge that was more widespread than we currently understand. While direct evidence of contact between the Maya and Amazonian societies remains limited, the similarities in their approaches to landscape management and urban design invite comparison, not as proof of a single origin, but as an indication that certain principles may have been discovered, developed, and refined in different contexts, leading to outcomes that share common features. The concept of a mother civilization, a single source from which these ideas spread, is one possibility, though it remains speculative and difficult to confirm with the evidence available. Another possibility is that these societies arrived at similar solutions independently, guided by the constraints and opportunities of their environments, and by a shared human capacity for observation, experimentation, and adaptation. In either case, the result is a picture of the ancient Americas that is far more complex and interconnected than previously imagined, one in which the boundaries between natural and artificial landscapes are blurred, and where the forest itself becomes a record of human activity rather than a backdrop to it. The idea that the jungle was designed does not mean that it was built in the same way as a city of stone, but that it was shaped over time through a series of choices, practices, and interactions that gradually transformed it into a system capable of sustaining life at scale. This kind of design is not always visible in the way that buildings or monuments are, because it is embedded in the structure of the environment itself, in the distribution of plants, the composition of soil, the flow of water, and the arrangement of space. It is a form of knowledge that operates at a different level, one that requires a long-term perspective and a deep understanding of ecological processes, and it may be one of the reasons why these civilizations have been so difficult to recognize in the archaeological record, because their achievements do not always take the form of durable, easily identifiable structures. As modern researchers continue to explore these regions using new technologies and methods, more details are likely to emerge, revealing additional layers of complexity and connection. Each new discovery adds to the sense that our understanding of these landscapes is still incomplete, that there are aspects of their history that remain hidden, not because they were never there, but because we have not yet learned how to see them. The jungle, once thought to be a barrier to civilization, now appears as a medium through which civilization expressed itself, a living system that reflects the choices and knowledge of the people who inhabited it. This shift in perspective has broader implications, not just for archaeology, but for the way we think about human interaction with the environment, because it suggests that sustainable large-scale systems can be created without the kinds of disruption that are often associated with modern development. It invites us to reconsider the relationship between technology and nature, to recognize that innovation does not always require the extraction or replacement of natural systems, but can instead involve working within them, enhancing their capabilities while maintaining their balance. The civilizations of the Maya and the Amazon, as they are gradually revealed, offer examples of this approach, not as idealized models, but as evidence of what is possible when knowledge is applied in ways that are attuned to the environment rather than imposed upon it. As we look out over these forests today, seeing only the surface, it is easy to overlook the layers beneath, the patterns that are not immediately visible, the histories that are embedded in the land itself. But with each new scan, each new excavation, the picture becomes clearer, not in a way that resolves all questions, but in a way that expands them, showing that the story of these regions is far richer and more complex than we once believed. The jungle was not empty, not untouched, not a void waiting to be filled. but a space that was already inhabited, already shaped, already understood in ways that we are only beginning to rediscover. And in that realization, there is a shift, not just in what we know, but in how we think about the past, moving from a view of isolation and limitation to one of connection, adaptation, and design, where the boundaries between civilization and nature are not fixed but fluid, and where the traces of human presence can be found not only in what stands above the ground, but in the very fabric of the environment itself. We leave behind cities hidden beneath trees, to a mountain that was never a mountain at all. In the heart of central Mexico, where the land rises gently beneath wide skies and distant volcanoes watch over the valley, there stands a hill that for centuries was believed to be exactly that, a natural formation shaped by time, covered in grass, crowned with a church, and woven quietly into the landscape as if it had always belonged there. Travelers passed by it without question, locals lived beside it without suspecting its true nature, and even those who built upon it did so without realizing that beneath their feet lay something far older, far larger, and far more deliberate than anyone could have imagined. This is the Great Pyramid of Cholula, known in the Nahuatl language as Tlaxihualtepetl, meaning man-made mountain, a name that, in hindsight, feels less like a description and more like a warning that went unnoticed. For what appears to be a hill is in fact the largest pyramid ever constructed by volume anywhere in the world, a structure that surpasses even the Great Pyramid of Giza in sheer mass, not through height, but through breadth, its base stretching approximately 400 meters on each side, its bulk rising gradually beneath layers of earth that have concealed it so completely that it merged with the natural terrain. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, which stand exposed and sharply defined against the desert, Cholula's pyramid hides in plain sight, its edges softened, its angles obscured, its true form revealed only when excavation began to peel back the surface and expose the geometry beneath. What emerged was not a single structure built in one moment, but a layered monument, constructed and reconstructed over centuries, each generation adding to what came before, expanding it outward, enclosing earlier phases within new ones, creating a kind of architectural archive where time itself was built into the walls. Archaeologists have identified multiple construction stages, at least 6 major phases, each corresponding to different periods and cultural influences, suggesting that the pyramid was not the work of a single civilization, but a shared endeavor that spanned generations, perhaps even different peoples, each one contributing to its growth, each one reshaping it according to their own beliefs and practices. This process of building over previous layers is unusual in its scale and intention, because it does not simply replace the old with the new, but preserves it, entombs it, as if the earlier structures were not meant to be destroyed, but to be protected, hidden, or transformed into something else. Deep within the pyramid, tunnels carved by archaeologists in the 20th century reveal fragments of these earlier layers, painted murals, carved stone, and remnants of spaces that once stood open to the sky, now sealed within the mass of the structure, their purpose no longer immediately clear, their presence suggesting that the pyramid is not just a monument, but a record of change, of continuity, of something that was meant to endure even as it evolved. The materials used in its construction further add to its distinct character, as the pyramid is composed primarily of adobe bricks, sun-dried and carefully arranged, bound together with earth and clay, forming a structure that, despite its age and exposure to the elements, has remained remarkably stable. This choice of material reflects both the resources available and the knowledge of those who built it, an understanding of how to create durability without relying on stone, how to shape a massive form that could withstand time, not through hardness, but through cohesion and balance. The pyramid's surface, once likely smooth and defined, has over centuries been covered by soil and vegetation, allowing it to blend into its surroundings, to become something that appears natural, even though its origins are entirely human. Atop this structure stands the church of Nuestra Señora de los Remedios, built by Spanish colonizers in the 16th century, a symbol of a new belief system placed quite literally on top of an older one, without the builders realizing that they were constructing their place of worship on what was already a sacred site, one that had been venerated for centuries before their arrival. This layering of structures, of beliefs, of histories, creates a physical and symbolic overlap that is difficult to ignore, a reminder that the past does not disappear, but often remains beneath the surface, influencing what comes after in ways that are not always visible. The purpose of the pyramid has been the subject of much study and speculation, with evidence suggesting that it was dedicated to the feathered serpent deity known in various cultures as Quetzalcoatl, a figure associated with wind, knowledge, and renewal, whose presence in Mesoamerican mythology spans multiple regions and periods. The pyramid's alignment and design may have been intended to reflect cosmological ideas, to serve as a connection between the earth and the heavens, a place where rituals could be performed to maintain balance, to mark cycles, to engage with forces that were seen as essential to the continuity of life. Yet, the deeper one looks into its structure, the more questions arise, particularly regarding the decision to build over earlier phases rather than dismantle them. This practice suggests a relationship with the past that is not about erasure, but about integration, about carrying forward what came before in a way that is both literal and symbolic. It raises the possibility that the pyramid was not just a functional space, but a sacred one in which each layer held meaning, where the act of building was itself part of a ritual process, a way of renewing or reinforcing a connection to something that was believed to exist within the structure. The myths associated with Cholula add another dimension to this mystery, stories passed down through generations that speak of giants, of floods, of a time when the world was different, when beings of great size and power sought to build a structure that would reach the sky, only to be stopped by divine intervention, their work left unfinished, their presence fading into legend. These stories, while often dismissed as symbolic or metaphorical, may carry fragments of memory, reflections of events or ideas that have been transformed over time into narrative form. The theme of a great flood, for example, appears in many cultures, suggesting a shared awareness of environmental events that left lasting impressions on human societies. The idea of giants building monumental structures may reflect a perception of the scale and effort involved, a way of expressing the difficulty of such construction in terms that elevate it beyond ordinary human capability. Whether these myths are rooted in specific historical events or are purely symbolic, they contribute to the sense that Cholula is more than just an architectural achievement, that it is embedded in a network of meanings that extend beyond its physical form. The question of why the pyramid was gradually buried, whether intentionally or as a result of natural processes, remains open. Some researchers suggest that the covering of the structure may have been deliberate, a way of preserving it, of protecting what lay within, or of marking a transition in its use or significance. Others point to the accumulation of soil and vegetation over time, combined with the abandonment of certain practices, as factors that allowed the pyramid to become hidden. Yet the idea that it was intentionally concealed continues to hold a certain appeal because it aligns with the pattern of building over earlier layers, of enclosing rather than removing, of creating a structure that holds within it multiple moments in time. If this was the case, then the pyramid becomes not just a monument, but a container, a place where something was placed, preserved, or perhaps even hidden from view. The tunnels that now run through the pyramid, extending for kilometers, offer glimpses into its interior, but they represent only a fraction of what lies within. Large portions remain unexplored, their contents unknown, their spaces unexamined due to the challenges of excavation and preservation. This leaves open the possibility that there are still chambers, artifacts, or features that have not yet been discovered, elements that could provide further insight into the purpose and history of the structure. The scale of the pyramid makes complete exploration difficult, and the presence of the church above adds another layer of complexity, limiting the extent to which excavation can be carried out. As a result, Cholula remains partially understood, a site where knowledge is incomplete, where each discovery raises new questions rather than providing definitive answers. Standing at its base, or at its summit beneath the church, one is struck by the contrast between what is visible and what is hidden, between the familiar shape of a hill and the reality of a vast, constructed form beneath it. It challenges the way we perceive landscapes, reminding us that what appears natural may not always be so, that human activity can be integrated into the environment in ways that are not immediately apparent. It also invites a reconsideration of how we define monuments, not just as structures that stand apart from their surroundings, but as forms that can merge with them, that can become part of the landscape itself. The Great Pyramid of Cholula does not dominate its environment in the way some monuments do, but rather becomes part of it, its presence subtle, its significance revealed only through investigation. This quality, this ability to exist both as a natural feature and as a human creation, adds to its mystery, making it a site that resists simple classification. As we continue to study it, to map its layers, to analyze its materials, we gain a clearer picture of how it was built, how it changed over time, how it functioned within the societies that created it. But the deeper questions remain about intention, about meaning, about the decisions that led to its current form. Why was it built in this way? Why were earlier structures preserved within it? Why was it allowed or made to become hidden? These are not questions that can be answered easily because they involve not just physical evidence, but interpretation, an attempt to understand the mindset of people who lived in a different context, who saw the world through a different lens. The pyramid stands as a reminder that history is not always visible on the surface, that it can be layered, concealed, integrated into the very ground beneath our feet. And as we look at this mountain that was never a mountain, we are left with a thought that lingers, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility, one that shifts the way we think about what we see and what we might be missing. What if they buried something on purpose? We leave behind a pyramid buried in silence, to one that seems to hesitate halfway to the sky. In the desert south of Cairo, where the horizon is broken by shapes that rise from the sand like memories carved into stone, there stands a structure that feels different even from a distance, a pyramid that does not follow the clean, confident lines we have come to associate with ancient Egypt, but instead appears to change its mind as it ascends, beginning with a steep, determined slope, and then, abruptly, softening into a gentler angle, as if something caused its builders to pause, reconsider, and adjust their course while the monument was already taking shape. This is the bent pyramid, built during the reign of Sneferu, a ruler often remembered not only for his power, but for his role in transforming pyramid construction from early experimental forms into the smooth-sided structures that would later define the Egyptian skyline. Yet, among the monuments attributed to him, this pyramid stands apart, not because it failed, but because it reveals a moment of uncertainty, a visible record of change embedded in its very geometry. The lower portion of the pyramid rises at an angle of about 54 degrees, a steep incline that gives it a sense of ambition, of reaching quickly toward the sky. But about halfway up, the angle shifts to approximately 43 degrees, creating the distinctive bent profile that has puzzled historians, engineers, and observers for generations. This change is not subtle, but clearly intentional, a decision that required the builders to alter their approach while construction was already underway, raising questions about why such a shift was necessary and what it reveals about the process behind it. One of the most widely accepted explanations is that the original angle proved too steep, causing structural concerns as the pyramid grew taller, with internal stresses leading to cracks or instability that forced the builders to reduce the slope to prevent collapse. Evidence of these stresses can be seen in the internal chambers, where signs of strain suggest that the structure was under pressure, prompting a response that prioritized stability over symmetry. Yet even this explanation does not fully resolve the mystery, because the adjustment appears to have been carried out with care, not as a rushed correction, but as a deliberate redesign that allowed the pyramid to be completed rather than abandoned. This suggests that the builders were not simply reacting to a problem, but adapting in a way that reflects both technical understanding and a willingness to modify their plans, a process that feels surprisingly modern in its approach. The bent pyramid is often seen as part of a sequence of experiments that took place during Sneferu's reign, a period in which the concept of the true pyramid was still evolving, moving away from earlier step pyramids toward the smooth-sided forms that would later be perfected. Before this structure, there was the pyramid at Meidum, which appears to have partially collapsed, possibly during or shortly after its construction, leaving behind a core that hints at an earlier stage in the development of pyramid design. After the bent pyramid, Sneferu commissioned the red pyramid, which maintains a consistent angle throughout, and is considered the first successful example of a true pyramid, its form stable, its structure coherent, its design refined. In this context, the bent pyramid becomes a bridge between attempts and achievements, a structure that captures the moment when knowledge was still being tested, when solutions were being discovered through experience rather than established formulas. Yet the bent pyramid is not only unusual in its external shape, but also in its internal design, which adds further layers to its mystery. Unlike other pyramids of the time, it features two separate entrances, one on the northern face, positioned above ground level, and another on the western side, closer to the base, each leading to its own system of passages and chambers. These two internal pathways do not connect in a straightforward way, creating a layout that is more complex than expected, as if the pyramid was designed to serve multiple purposes or to accommodate different aspects of a broader concept. The northern entrance follows a more traditional route, descending into the structure and leading to a chamber with a high, corbelled ceiling, while the western entrance leads to a different chamber, also carefully constructed, but distinct in its orientation and access. The presence of two chambers has led to various interpretations, some suggesting that one may have been intended as a decoy to deter tomb robbers, while the other served as the true burial space, though no definitive evidence supports this conclusively. Others propose that the dual chambers reflect a symbolic division representing different aspects of the pharaoh's existence, perhaps the physical body and the spiritual essence, each requiring its own space within the monument. This idea aligns with broader Egyptian beliefs about the nature of the self, which was understood to consist of multiple components, including the K and the Ba, each with its own role in the journey after death. If the pyramid was designed with this in mind, then its unusual layout may not be a flaw, but a feature, a deliberate attempt to embody these concepts in physical form. Adding to the intrigue is the absence of a confirmed burial within the pyramid. Despite extensive exploration, no mummy, sarcophagus, or definitive burial goods have been found inside, leaving open the question of whether Sneferu was ever interred there at all. Some evidence points to the Red Pyramid as his likely final resting place, supported by inscriptions and the absence of similar anomalies in its design. suggesting that the bent pyramid may have been abandoned as a burial site in favor of a more stable structure. However, the bent pyramid was completed, its casing stones largely intact, its form finished, which raises the question of why such effort would be invested in a monument that was not used for its intended purpose. This has led to the idea that it may have served a symbolic function, a cenotaph or ceremonial structure designed to represent the pharaoh's journey or status, rather than to house his physical remains. In this interpretation, the pyramid becomes less about burial and more about meaning, a structure that embodies ideas about transformation, ascent, and the relationship between the earthly and the divine. The preservation of its outer casing adds to its significance, as it remains one of the few pyramids where the original smooth limestone covering is still largely visible, giving a sense of how these monuments would have appeared when newly constructed, their surfaces reflecting sunlight, their edges sharp and defined, their presence striking against the desert landscape. This visual aspect was not merely aesthetic, but symbolic, as the brightness of the pyramid was associated with the sun, with light, with the divine, reinforcing the connection between the pharaoh and the celestial realm. The orientation of the pyramid, aligned closely with the cardinal directions, further reflects the precision and intention behind its design, suggesting an awareness of astronomy and geography that was integrated into the construction process. Some theories have explored the possibility that the change in angle was not purely structural, but also symbolic, perhaps reflecting different stages of the sun's movement or representing a transition between realms. Though such interpretations remain speculative and are difficult to confirm with the available evidence, what remains clear is that the bent pyramid does not fit neatly into a single category, not as a failure, not as a perfect success, but as something in between, a structure that captures a moment of transition, of learning, of adjustment. It reveals a process that is often hidden in the finished products of history, the trial and error, the decisions made in response to challenges, the willingness to change course in pursuit of a goal that is not yet fully understood. It also highlights the human element behind these monuments, the builders who worked with the materials, who observed the results of their efforts, who adapted their techniques based on what they encountered. In this sense, the pyramid becomes more than a static object. It becomes a record of activity, of thought, of problem solving, a physical manifestation of a process that unfolded over time. The idea that it changed its mind is, of course, a metaphor, but it captures something real about the structure, the way it embodies a shift in direction, a visible sign that the original plan was altered, that the builders responded to something that required them to rethink their approach. This quality gives the bent pyramid a unique place among the monuments of ancient Egypt, not as the most imposing or the most refined, but as one of the most revealing, offering insight into the development of an idea that would later be realized in more consistent forms. It stands as a reminder that even in a civilization known for its precision and order, there were moments of uncertainty, of experimentation, of adaptation, and that these moments are just as important in understanding the past as the achievements that followed. As we look at the bent pyramid today, rising from the desert with its distinctive profile, we see not just a monument, but a story, one that is written not in words, but in angles, in spaces, in the decisions that shaped its form. It invites us to consider not only what was built, but how it was built, and why it took the shape that it did, to look beyond the surface and recognize the layers of intention and response that are embedded within it. And in doing so, it leaves us with a perspective that is both grounded and open, acknowledging the knowledge and skill of its creators, while also recognizing the limits of our understanding, the gaps that remain, the questions that continue to be asked. The bent pyramid does not provide simple answers, but it does offer something perhaps more valuable, a glimpse into the process of creation, into the moment when certainty gives way to adjustment, when a structure becomes a reflection not just of a goal, but of the journey toward it, a structure caught between trial and intention. We leave behind a pyramid full of questions, to a river that once shaped an empire, then vanished completely. For thousands of years, the story of ancient Egypt has been told through its monuments, its temples, its pyramids rising from the desert as symbols of permanence, as if they had always stood in the same silent, sunlit landscape we see today, isolated against a sea of sand, disconnected from anything but the sky above them. The Nile, the great river that sustained this civilization, is still there, flowing steadily through the land, and it has long been assumed that the geography we see now is more or less the same as it was in antiquity, that the placement of pyramids and cities reflects a landscape that has remained stable over time. But recent discoveries have begun to challenge that assumption, revealing that the Egypt of the past may have looked very different, shaped by waterways that no longer exist, by features that have been erased so completely that they left almost no visible trace. Among these discoveries is what researchers now refer to as the Ahramat branch, a lost channel of the Nile that once ran parallel to the main river, stretching for dozens of kilometers along the western edge of the floodplain, precisely in the region where many of Egypt's most famous pyramids were constructed. This ancient river, now buried beneath layers of sediment and desert sand, was not a minor tributary, but a substantial waterway, wide enough and deep enough to support boats, transport materials, and connect different parts of the landscape in ways that are no longer visible. Its existence was not known through traditional archaeology, because there were no obvious surface indicators, no remaining water, no clear depressions that could be easily identified, only subtle variations in the ground that were difficult to interpret without advanced tools. It was only with the use of modern technology, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and sediment analysis, that researchers began to detect a long, continuous feature beneath the surface, a pattern that suggested the former presence of a river channel, one that had been gradually filled in over time until it disappeared from view entirely. The implications of this discovery are significant, not only for understanding the geography of ancient Egypt, but for reinterpreting the way its monuments were constructed and used. Many of the pyramids, including those at Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur, are aligned in ways that suggest a relationship with this lost branch, with causeways extending from the main structures toward what would have been the river's edge, indicating that these sites were once connected to water rather than isolated in desert. This connection would have been essential for transporting the massive stone blocks used in construction, as moving such materials over land would have been far more difficult than using boats along a navigable channel. It also suggests that the ceremonial aspects of these sites, including the movement of the pharaoh's body and the performance of rituals, may have involved the river in ways that are no longer immediately apparent. The idea that the pyramids once stood beside a flowing waterway changes the image of these monuments, transforming them from solitary structures in a barren landscape into parts of a dynamic environment where water, movement, and activity played a central role. The disappearance of this river branch raises questions about how such a significant feature could vanish so completely. Rivers are not static. They shift over time, changing course, splitting into branches, merging, and sometimes drying up, influenced by a combination of factors, including climate, sedimentation, and geological processes. In the case of the Ahramat branch, evidence suggests that its decline was gradual rather than sudden, influenced by changes in climate that reduced the overall flow of the Nile, particularly during periods of prolonged drought. One such event, often referred to as the 4.2 kilo-year event, affected large parts of the ancient world, leading to decreased rainfall and changes in river systems across regions. As water levels dropped, smaller branches of the Nile would have received less flow, making them more susceptible to being filled in by sediment carried by the wind and the remaining water. Over time, this process would have reduced the channel's capacity, eventually cutting it off from the main river and leaving it to dry out completely. At the same time, geological factors may have played a role, with subtle shifts in the earth causing the main flow of the Nile to move eastward, further isolating the branch and accelerating its decline. The combination of these processes would have gradually transformed a once active river into a buried feature, its course preserved only in the layers of sediment beneath the surface. What makes this process particularly intriguing is that it likely occurred over generations, meaning that the people living at the time may have experienced it as a slow change rather than a sudden disappearance. For those involved in the construction of the pyramids, the river would have been present, a vital part of their environment, but for later generations, its absence would have altered the landscape, changing the way these sites were accessed and understood. This gradual shift may also have had broader implications for the society itself, as changes in water availability can affect agriculture, trade, and settlement patterns, potentially contributing to periods of instability or transition. Some researchers have suggested that the weakening and eventual loss of this branch may have played a role in the decline of the Old Kingdom, as the infrastructure that supported large-scale construction and centralized control became more difficult to maintain without reliable water routes. While this is only one of several factors that may have influenced this period, it highlights the importance of environmental conditions in shaping historical outcomes, reminding us that even the most powerful civilizations are dependent on the systems that sustain them. The fact that this river remained hidden for so long, undetected despite centuries of exploration and study, underscores the limitations of traditional methods when it comes to understanding landscapes that have changed over time. It also demonstrates the value of new technologies in revealing aspects of the past that were previously inaccessible, allowing researchers to look beneath the surface and reconstruct features that have been erased from view. Satellite imagery can detect subtle differences in soil composition and moisture retention. Ground-penetrating radar can map structures and layers below the earth, and sediment analysis can identify the types of materials deposited in different areas, all contributing to a more detailed understanding of how the landscape has evolved. These tools do not replace traditional archaeology, but complement it, providing new ways of asking questions and interpreting evidence. As more data is collected and analyzed, it is possible that additional lost features will be identified, not only in Egypt, but in other regions where environmental changes have altered the surface of the land. This raises a broader point about the nature of history and the way it is preserved. We often think of the past as something that is fixed, recorded in monuments, artifacts, and texts that remain relatively stable over time, but the environments in which these elements exist are not static. Rivers change course, coastlines shift, forests grow and recede, deserts expand, and all of these processes can obscure or transform the evidence of human activity. This means that our understanding of the past is always incomplete, shaped not only by what was created, but by what has survived and what we have been able to find. The discovery of the Aramat branch reminds us that there may be entire aspects of historical landscapes that are currently hidden, waiting to be revealed through new methods and perspectives. It also invites us to reconsider the relationship between human societies and their environments, recognizing that the two are deeply interconnected and that changes in one can have profound effects on the other. The pyramids, often seen as symbols of permanence, are in fact part of a dynamic system, one that included waterways, transportation networks, and environmental conditions that have changed over time. By reconstructing these elements, we gain a more complete picture of how these monuments functioned within their original context, how they were built, used, and experienced by the people who created them. Standing before the pyramids today, it is easy to imagine them as isolated achievements, rising from the desert as if they were always meant to stand alone. But the presence of the lost river suggests a different image, one in which these structures were connected to a living landscape, where water flowed, boats moved, and activity surrounded them. This shift in perspective does not diminish their significance, but adds to it, revealing a level of integration and complexity that goes beyond the structures themselves. It also serves as a reminder that the past is not always visible in the ways we expect, that it can be hidden beneath layers of change, waiting for the right tools and questions to bring it back into view. As we continue to explore and reinterpret the evidence, we may find that other aspects of ancient environments have been similarly obscured, offering new insights into the ways in which human societies have interacted with the world around them. The river that disappeared beneath the sands of Egypt is not just a geological feature, but a key to understanding a broader system, one that shaped the rise and function of one of the most iconic civilizations in history. And in recognizing its existence, we are reminded that the foundations of that civilization were not built on static ground, but on a landscape that has changed, that has shifted, that has hidden parts of its own story beneath the surface. History, it seems, is not only written in stone, but also in water, and sometimes the most important chapters are the ones that have quietly disappeared. We leave behind a river swallowed by sand, to a city drawn in a perfect circle, as if designed with something more than survival in mind. In the wide, open plains of northern Mesopotamia, where the land stretches beneath a vast sky and the wind moves freely across dry earth, there rises a set of ruins that, even in their silence, feel deliberate, as if every stone was placed not only with purpose, but with a kind of awareness that goes beyond immediate need. This is Hatra, a city that once stood at the crossroads of empires, a place where cultures met, beliefs blended, and architecture took on a form that continues to intrigue those who study it. From above, the shape of Hatra becomes unmistakable, a near-perfect circle, its outer walls tracing a continuous line that encloses the city like a boundary drawn with intention, not dictated by terrain, not shaped by accident, but defined by a choice that seems almost symbolic. The walls themselves were formidable, constructed of stone and reinforced with towers placed at regular intervals, creating a defensive system that was both strong and efficient. Yet it is the geometry of the layout that draws the most attention, the way the circle organizes space, the way it creates a sense of order that feels different from the more irregular forms of many ancient cities. Within this circular boundary, the city was structured with layers, concentric zones that guided movement and defined areas of activity, with temples, public spaces, and residential areas arranged in relation to one another in a way that suggests planning at a level that goes beyond simple expansion. The central area of Hatra was dominated by a complex of temples, large, open courtyards surrounded by high walls and monumental entrances where religious practices were carried out and where the city's identity as a spiritual center was most visible. What makes this religious landscape particularly interesting is its diversity, as Hatra was home to multiple deities from different traditions, including Mesopotamian, Greek, Persian, and Arabian influences, all coexisting within the same space, creating a kind of cultural intersection that reflects the city's position along important trade routes. Temples dedicated to gods such as Shamash, the sun deity, stood alongside those honoring other figures, each contributing to a layered spiritual environment where different beliefs were not only present, but integrated into the fabric of the city. This coexistence of traditions suggests a level of openness and adaptability, a recognition that the city's strength may have come not just from its walls, but from its ability to bring together different peoples and ideas. Historically, Hatra rose to prominence during the Parthian period, serving as a fortified city that benefited from its strategic location between larger empires, allowing it to maintain a degree of independence while engaging in trade and cultural exchange. Its defenses were tested multiple times, most notably by the Roman Empire, which sought to expand its influence into the region. Roman forces, including those led by emperors such as Trajan and later Septimius Severus, attempted to capture the city, but were unable to breach its walls, a testament not only to the strength of its construction, but to the effectiveness of its design. The circular layout may have contributed to this resilience, allowing defenders to move efficiently within the city, to respond to threats from any direction, and to maintain a unified defensive line that did not rely on weak points or irregular edges. The walls, combined with the positioning of towers and gates, created a system that was difficult to penetrate, and the city's ability to withstand these sieges added to its reputation as a place that could resist even the most powerful forces of its time. Yet despite this strength, despite its ability to endure external pressure, the story of Hatra does not end with a gradual decline or a long period of transformation, but with a sudden shift that remains difficult to fully explain. In the early 3rd century, during the rise of the Sasanian Empire, the city faced a new challenge, one that it was not able to overcome. Historical accounts suggest that Hatra eventually fell, its defenses breached, its structures damaged, and its role as a major center brought to an end. However, what is less clear is what happened to the people who lived there. Archaeological evidence does not point to a single catastrophic event that wiped out the population, but rather to a pattern of abandonment, where the city was left behind, its buildings remaining, its layout intact, but its life gone. This transition from a thriving center to an empty space adds another layer to the mystery, because it raises questions about how a city that was so carefully designed, so well defended, and so culturally rich could lose its inhabitants in a way that leaves so few direct clues. Some theories suggest that the fall of Hatra was accompanied by displacement, with its population moving elsewhere as political and economic conditions changed, integrating into other regions and leaving the city behind as a relic of a previous era. Others point to the possibility of environmental factors, changes in trade routes, or shifts in power that made the city less viable as a center of activity. There are also local legends that speak of curses, of divine retribution, of forces that went beyond the physical, reflecting a human tendency to explain sudden change through narrative when direct evidence is limited. These stories, while not necessarily historical in a literal sense, contribute to the atmosphere of the site, to the sense that something about Hatra resists simple explanation. The design of the city itself continues to invite interpretation, particularly in relation to the idea that its geometry may have had meaning beyond practicality. The circle, as a shape, has long been associated with concepts of completeness, unity, and continuity, and its use in the layout of Hatra may reflect an intention to create a space that embodies these ideas, not just in function, but in form. The alignment of structures, the orientation of gates, and the positioning of temples in relation to the sun and other celestial elements have led some researchers to explore the possibility that the city was designed with an awareness of astronomical patterns, that its layout was not only defensive, but symbolic, connecting the physical space of the city with a broader understanding of the cosmos. While such interpretations remain speculative, they highlight the ways in which architecture can carry multiple layers of meaning, serving practical needs while also expressing ideas that are less tangible. Walking through the ruins of Hatra today, one can still trace the outlines of its design, the curve of its walls, the arrangement of its spaces, the remnants of structures that once defined its identity. The stones, weathered by time, still hold their positions, still reflect the choices made by those who built them, choices that were not random, but guided by a vision that integrated defense, culture, and belief into a single, coherent form. The silence of the site, the absence of the people who once inhabited it, creates a contrast that is both striking and thought-provoking, because it allows the design itself to stand out, to be observed without the distraction of activity, to be considered in terms of its structure and intention. It becomes possible to see the city not just as a place that was lived in, but as an idea that was constructed, a concept made physical, one that continues to exist even after its original context has disappeared. The question that remains is not only how Hatra was built or how it functioned, but why it was designed in the way that it was, what motivations and understandings guided its creation, and how those elements contributed to its rise and eventual abandonment. It is easy to focus on the practical aspects, the need for defense, the advantages of location, the benefits of trade, but the consistency and precision of its layout suggest that there may have been additional considerations, factors that are not immediately visible, but that influence the choices made by its builders. These could include cultural values, symbolic associations, or even aesthetic preferences that shaped the way space was organized and experienced. In this sense, Hatra becomes more than a historical site. It becomes a case study in how design can reflect a way of thinking, how the arrangement of structures can express ideas that go beyond immediate function. As we consider the city in its entirety, from its circular walls to its central temples, from its role as a hub of diverse beliefs to its ability to withstand external threats, we are presented with a picture that is both detailed and incomplete, a structure that reveals much about its creators, but also leaves room for interpretation. The fact that it was eventually abandoned does not diminish its significance, but rather adds to it, because it introduces a dimension of change that is not fully understood, a reminder that even the most carefully designed systems can be altered by forces that are not always predictable. The enduring presence of Hatra, its form still visible, its layout still traceable, allows us to engage with these questions in a direct way, to observe the results of decisions made long ago, and to consider how those decisions continue to resonate. In the end, what stands out is not just the fact that Hatra existed, but the way it was conceived, the sense that its design was guided by something more than immediate necessity, something that integrated practical needs with a broader vision, creating a space that feels intentional beyond function, a city that, even in its ruins, continues to suggest that its builders were thinking not only about survival, but about meaning. We leave behind a city that resisted empires, to one that chose to destroy itself. Beneath the rolling plains of Eastern Europe, where the soil is rich and dark and the seasons move in steady rhythm, archaeologists uncovered traces of a civilization that does not fit easily into the patterns we expect from the ancient world, a culture that built large, organized settlements long before many of the better-known centers of early civilization had even taken shape, yet left behind no monuments to kings, no evidence of conquest, no signs of the kind of centralized power that usually defines complex societies. This was the Tripilian civilization, also known as the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, which flourished roughly between 5000 and 3000 BCE across regions that are now part of Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, creating settlements that were not only extensive in size, but carefully planned in ways that suggest a deep understanding of spatial organization. From above, these settlements reveal a striking pattern: concentric circles of houses arranged around a central open space, forming layouts that are both functional and symbolic, with some sites expanding to cover hundreds of hectares and containing thousands of structures, enough to support populations that may have reached tens of thousands of people, making them among the largest known settlements of their time. The houses themselves were constructed from a combination of clay, wood, and straw, often built in similar styles with little variation, suggesting a level of uniformity that contrasts sharply with the hierarchical architecture seen in other ancient cultures, where differences in size and decoration often reflect social status. Here, the relative equality in housing points toward a society that may have operated without rigid class divisions, where wealth and power were not expressed through monumental structures or elite residences, but through shared forms and communal organization. Inside these homes, archaeologists found evidence of daily life, pottery, tools, figurines, and remnants of hearths, all arranged in ways that indicate structured living spaces. Yet none of these artifacts point clearly to the presence of rulers or governing elites. There are no palaces, no fortifications, no large-scale weapons caches that would suggest organized warfare, and this absence has led many researchers to consider the possibility that Trypillian society was relatively peaceful, or at least not defined by the kind of conflict that leaves clear archaeological traces. What makes this civilization particularly unusual, however, is not only how it lived, but how it chose to end each phase of its existence. Across numerous sites, archaeologists discovered layers of burned remains, entire settlements that had been intentionally set on fire, with houses collapsing inward as their wooden structures were consumed by flames, leaving behind hardened clay shells that preserved the shapes of walls and interiors. This was not an isolated event, but a repeated pattern, occurring at regular intervals, sometimes every 60 to 80 years, suggesting that the burning of these settlements was not accidental, not the result of external attack or natural disaster, but a deliberate act carried out by the inhabitants themselves. Before the fires, people appear to have carefully prepared their homes, placing objects inside, arranging items in ways that suggest intention rather than haste, as if the act of burning was part of a ritual process rather than a response to crisis. The intensity of the fires was often high enough to transform the clay walls into a ceramic-like material, effectively preserving the structures in their final state, creating a kind of archaeological snapshot that captures the moment of transformation. After these events, new settlements would be established nearby, built in similar patterns, following the same circular layouts, continuing the cycle of construction, occupation, and eventual destruction. This repetition raises questions about the meaning behind these actions, because from a practical perspective, the deliberate destruction of entire communities seems counterintuitive, especially in a society that had invested significant effort into building them. One interpretation is that the burning represented a form of renewal, a symbolic resetting of the environment, allowing the community to start fresh, to clear away the old and make space for the new, both physically and spiritually. In this view, the destruction was not an end, but a transition, a necessary step in a cycle that mirrored natural processes, the way forests regenerate after fire, the way seasons change, the way life moves through phases of growth and renewal. Another possibility is that the burning had a ritual significance tied to beliefs about life, death, and transformation, perhaps connected to a worldview in which permanence was not valued in the same way as continuity, where the focus was on the ongoing process rather than the preservation of individual structures. The absence of fortifications and weapons, combined with the apparent lack of hierarchical differentiation, suggests that Trypillian society may have been organized around principles that differ significantly from those of later civilizations, where power, control, and accumulation often play central roles. Instead, it appears to have been a culture that emphasized balance, cooperation, and cyclical patterns, both in its spatial organization and in its practices. The central open spaces within the settlements may have served as communal areas for gatherings, rituals, or shared activities, reinforcing a sense of collective identity rather than individual dominance. The figurines found at many sites, often representing female forms with exaggerated features, have been interpreted by some as symbols of fertility or representations of a mother goddess, suggesting that spiritual beliefs may have centered on themes of creation, growth, and the cycles of nature. These interpretations remain debated, but they contribute to the broader picture of a society that may have understood itself in relation to the natural world in ways that influenced its choices and behaviors. The scale of some Trypillian settlements challenges the idea that early complex societies required hierarchical structures to function effectively, managing large populations, coordinating construction, organizing resources, and maintaining social cohesion over extended periods would have required systems of communication and cooperation that are not immediately visible in the archaeological record. The uniformity of construction suggests shared knowledge and practices, possibly transmitted through communal learning rather than centralized control. The repeated rebuilding of settlements indicates a continuity of tradition, a passing down of methods and ideas across generations, even as individual structures were destroyed and replaced. This continuity, combined with the cyclical pattern of burning and rebuilding, creates a sense of stability that is not based on permanence, but on repetition, on the assurance that what is lost will be recreated, that the community will endure even as its physical form changes. The eventual disappearance of the Trypillian civilization adds another layer of complexity to its story. Around 3000 BCE, the large settlements begin to decline, with fewer sites showing the same scale and organization, and eventually the distinctive patterns that define the culture fade from the archaeological record. The reasons for this change are not fully understood, with theories ranging from environmental factors, such as soil depletion or climate shifts, to interactions with incoming groups that may have altered the social and cultural landscape. There is no clear evidence of a single event that caused the collapse, no definitive signs of invasion or catastrophe, but rather a gradual transformation that led to the dispersal or integration of the population into other cultures. This quiet ending mirrors, in some ways, the cyclical nature of the civilization itself, a fading rather than a dramatic conclusion, consistent with a pattern that does not emphasize permanence. As archaeologists continue to study these sites, using new techniques to analyze soil, artifacts, and settlement patterns, more details emerge about how these communities functioned, how they organized space, how they interacted with their environment, and how they maintained continuity over time. Each discovery adds to the understanding of a civilization that challenges conventional models, offering an alternative perspective on how complex societies can develop and sustain themselves. The image of a city that burns itself repeatedly may seem destructive at first, but within the context of Trypillian culture, it appears to have been a deliberate and meaningful practice, one that reflects a different approach to time, to memory, and to the relationship between people and the spaces they inhabit. Standing in the remains of these settlements, where the outlines of houses can still be traced, where the layers of burned clay mark the passage of cycles, there is a sense of rhythm, of repetition, of a pattern that extends beyond individual lives. The absence of monumental structures or written records means that much of what we understand comes from these physical traces, from the arrangement of space and the evidence of repeated actions. This makes interpretation more challenging, but also more open, allowing for multiple perspectives on what these practices meant and how they were experienced by those who carried them out. The idea that a civilization could be built not on the accumulation of structures, but on the repetition of cycles, invites a reconsideration of what we mean by progress, by development, by success. It suggests that there are different ways of organizing society, different ways of relating to the environment and to time, and that these ways can be effective, even if they do not leave behind the kinds of monuments we are used to associating with ancient achievement. The Trypillian civilization, in its patterns of construction and destruction, offers a glimpse into a worldview where change is not something to be resisted, but something to be embraced, where the act of ending is part of the process of beginning, and where the continuity of the community is maintained not through the preservation of physical structures, but through the repetition of shared practices. In this sense, it stands as an example of a society built on cycles, not permanence, a reminder that history can take forms that are both unfamiliar and deeply human at the same time. We leave behind a people who embraced fire to a world built beneath the earth, just beyond the modern city of Xi'an, where the land appears quiet and unassuming, lies a landscape that hides one of the most intricate visions of the afterlife ever constructed, a place where death was not imagined as an absence, but as a continuation, a transition into another realm that required structure, order, and function just as much as the world above. This is the mausoleum complex of Emperor Jing of Han, often referred to as Hanyangling, a burial site that, at first glance, might seem less dramatic than the more famous terracotta army of his predecessor, yet reveals, upon closer examination, a system that is no less ambitious, no less detailed, and in many ways more subtle in its expression. Instead of towering statues and imposing formations, the underground chambers of Hanyangling contain tens of thousands of miniature figures, carefully arranged in pits that extend across a wide area, each one representing a component of a larger vision, a complete society recreated beneath the surface, scaled down, but no less deliberate in its design. These figures, numbering over 50,000, include soldiers, servants, animals, and officials, all crafted with attention to detail, yet intentionally smaller and less imposing than their counterparts in other tombs, suggesting a different approach to representing power and order. The soldiers stand in formation, their bodies shaped with proportion and balance, their faces individualized to a degree that hints at a recognition of identity, while the servants and attendants are positioned in ways that reflect their roles, carrying objects, preparing for tasks, or standing in readiness, as if waiting for a signal that will never come. The animals, including pigs, sheep, and dogs, are not decorative, but functional, part of a system that mirrors the agricultural and domestic life that sustained the living world, now transferred into the realm of the dead. What makes these figures particularly intriguing is the way they were constructed. Many of them were originally equipped with wooden arms, attached to their bodies in a manner that suggests articulation, allowing for movement, or at least the appearance of it, though the wood has long since decayed, leaving behind only the clay torsos and the sockets where these limbs once connected. This detail, subtle yet significant, has led to speculation that the figures were designed not just to stand, but to act, to embody roles within a system that was meant to function, not in a literal mechanical sense, but as a representation of activity, of life continuing in another form. The idea that these figures may have had movable parts, even if limited, adds to the sense that the tomb was conceived not as a static display, but as a dynamic environment, one in which the components were arranged to reflect processes, relationships, and interactions that define the living world. The layout of the mausoleum reinforces this impression. Rather than a single chamber, the site consists of multiple pits, each dedicated to different aspects of life: military, domestic, agricultural, administrative, all organized in a way that suggests a comprehensive plan, a blueprint for an entire society. These pits are connected by corridors and arranged in relation to the central burial mound, which houses the emperor himself, creating a spatial hierarchy that mirrors the structure of the empire above ground. The emperor, at the center, is surrounded by layers of activity, each one supporting and reflecting his authority, each one contributing to the maintenance of order in the afterlife. This arrangement is not arbitrary, but carefully designed, with each element placed in relation to others, forming a system that is both symbolic and functional within the context of belief. The concept of the afterlife in Han Dynasty China was deeply influenced by ideas of continuity, the belief that the soul would continue to exist and require the same kinds of support and resources that it had in life. This belief extended to the provision of goods, servants, and structures that would ensure comfort, stability, and authority beyond death. The Hanyangling Mausoleum takes this idea to an extraordinary level, not just providing objects, but recreating an entire environment, a world that is complete in its organization, where every role is represented, every function accounted for. The scale of this undertaking suggests not only the resources available to the emperor, but also the importance placed on ensuring that the transition from life to death did not disrupt the established order. The tomb becomes a continuation of the empire, a parallel system that exists beneath the surface, hidden from view but fully realized in its structure. The use of miniature figures rather than life-sized ones may reflect a shift in emphasis from the display of power to the representation of function, focusing on the relationships between elements rather than their individual prominence. This approach creates a sense of cohesion, where the parts work together to form a whole rather than competing for attention. The absence of large, imposing statues does not diminish the impact of the site, but instead draws attention to the complexity of its design, the way in which thousands of small elements come together to create something vast and interconnected. The idea of the tomb as a functioning world is further supported by the presence of objects that would have been used in daily life, tools, vessels, and other items that suggest activity, preparation, and maintenance. These are not random inclusions, but part of a system that anticipates needs, that provides for the continuation of routines, that ensures the emperor's existence in the afterlife is not one of isolation, but of integration within a structured environment. The careful placement of these objects, alongside the figures that would use them, reinforces the sense that this is not merely a symbolic arrangement, but a deliberate reconstruction of a living system. The concept of an underground empire, while metaphorical, captures the essence of what Hanyangling represents, a space where the boundaries between life and death are bridged through design, where the invisible is given form, and where the continuity of power and order is maintained beyond the physical world. The construction of such a site would have required coordination, planning, and a deep understanding of both material and belief, bringing together artisans, laborers, and officials in a process that mirrored the organization of the empire itself. Each figure, each object, each chamber contributes to a larger vision, one that extends beyond the individual to encompass a system that is meant to endure. The fact that much of this remains hidden, buried beneath the earth, adds to its mystery, as it exists largely out of sight, its full extent only partially revealed through excavation and study. This hidden quality aligns with its purpose as a space not meant for the living, but for the continuation of existence in another realm, a realm that is accessed not through direct experience, but through belief and representation. As archaeologists continue to uncover and analyze the site, new details emerge, offering insights into the techniques used to create the figures, the materials chosen, and the methods of organization that guided their placement. The preservation of the clay forms, despite the loss of organic components like wood and fabric, provides a window into the past, allowing us to see the structure of this underground world, even as some of its details have faded. The absence of certain elements, such as the wooden arms, becomes part of the narrative, a reminder of the passage of time and the transformation of materials, yet the overall system remains legible, its design still apparent, its intention still visible. The Hanyangling Mausoleum stands as a testament to a way of thinking about death that is not defined by finality, but by continuation, where the end of one form of existence leads to the beginning of another, structured, supported, and sustained by the same principles that governed life. It challenges the idea of the tomb as a static resting place, presenting instead a vision of an active environment, a world that, while silent and still, is conceptually alive, filled with roles, relationships, and functions that mirror those of the living. In this sense, it is not just a tomb, but a system, a carefully constructed model of an empire that exists beneath the surface, hidden yet complete, a reflection of a belief that life does not end, but changes form, continuing in ways that require preparation, intention, and design. We leave behind a tomb that feels almost alive, to patterns that appear across the entire ancient world. When we begin to step back from individual sites, from isolated discoveries and singular monuments, something subtle begins to emerge, not immediately obvious, not something that announces itself clearly, but a quiet repetition, a set of shapes and alignments that seem to echo across continents, across cultures that were separated by vast distances and, in many cases, by time itself. It starts with something simple: circles drawn into the earth, cities arranged in rings, settlements that expand outward in balanced layers, like ripples frozen in place, as if the idea of the circle held a meaning that went beyond practicality. We have already seen it in places like Hatra and the Tripilian settlements, where the circular form defines space in a way that feels intentional. But these are not isolated examples. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, similar patterns appear: ancient enclosures, ceremonial sites, and urban layouts that favor symmetry, proportion, and repetition. These forms are not identical, but they share a logic, a preference for balance, for shapes that create a sense of completeness, of unity, as if the builders were guided by principles that extended beyond immediate need. The same sense of pattern emerges when we look at pyramids, structures that rise from the ground in geometric precision, appearing in regions that had no known contact with one another. From the well-known pyramids of Egypt to those in Mesoamerica, to lesser-known examples in other parts of the world. While their construction methods and cultural context differ, the underlying form remains consistent: a base that anchors the structure, sides that converge toward a point, creating a shape that is both stable and directional, grounded and reaching upward at the same time. The alignment of these structures adds another layer to the mystery, as many of them are oriented in relation to cardinal directions, celestial events, or specific points in the sky, suggesting that their builders were not only concerned with the physical form, but with its relationship to a larger system, one that includes the movement of the sun, the stars, and the cycles that govern time. In Egypt, the pyramids of Giza are aligned with remarkable precision to the cardinal points, their orientation so exact that even with modern instruments, achieving the same level of accuracy would require careful measurement and adjustment. In Mesoamerica, structures like those at Teotihuacan follow a slightly different alignment, offset from true north, yet consistent across the site, indicating a deliberate choice rather than error. These patterns are not limited to large monuments, but can also be found in smaller structures, in the layout of roads, in the positioning of buildings, in the way space is divided and organized. The repetition of these geometric principles across different scales suggests that they were part of a broader understanding, a way of structuring the world that was applied in multiple contexts. The concept often referred to as sacred geometry attempts to describe this phenomenon, the idea that certain shapes and proportions carry meaning beyond their physical properties, that they reflect patterns found in nature, in the growth of plants, in the structure of crystals, in the movements of celestial bodies. While the term itself is modern, the underlying idea may have been present in ancient cultures, expressed not through formal definitions, but through practice, through the repeated use of certain forms that were observed to be effective, harmonious, or significant in ways that were understood intuitively. The use of ratios, such as those that approximate what we now call the golden ratio, appears in various contexts, though not always in a consistent or easily measurable way, suggesting that, while these proportions may have been recognized, they were not necessarily codified in the same way across all cultures. What is more consistent is the presence of symmetry, of balance, of repetition, elements that create a sense of order and coherence, whether in a single structure or across an entire landscape. When these patterns are viewed collectively, they raise a question that is difficult to answer definitively, whether these similarities are the result of independent development, different cultures arriving at similar solutions because they are effective or aesthetically pleasing, or whether there was some form of shared knowledge, a transmission of ideas that connected distant regions in ways that are not fully documented. The idea of a shared knowledge system is compelling because it offers a way to explain the consistency of certain forms, the recurrence of specific alignments, the sense that there is a common thread running through diverse expressions. However, it also raises challenges because the evidence for direct contact between many of these cultures is limited or absent, and the mechanisms by which such knowledge would have spread are not clearly established. On the other hand, the concept of independent development, often referred to as convergent evolution in a cultural context, suggests that humans, when faced with similar challenges or guided by similar observations, may arrive at similar solutions, not because they are copying one another, but because certain approaches naturally emerge as effective. The circle, for example, is an efficient way to enclose space, providing equal distance from a center point, which can be useful for both defense and organization. The pyramid shape offers stability, distributing weight in a way that allows for large structures to be built without advanced materials. Aligning structures with cardinal directions or celestial events can serve practical purposes, such as marking time or orienting space, while also carrying symbolic significance. These explanations do not require direct connection, but they do not fully account for the nuances, the specific choices that go beyond what is strictly necessary, the consistency in patterns that seem to reflect more than just functional considerations. There are also cases where patterns appear in ways that are less easily explained by practicality alone, such as the alignment of certain sites with specific astronomical events that would require careful observation and calculation, or the repetition of geometric layouts that are not the most efficient in terms of resource use, but seem to prioritize form and proportion. These instances suggest that there may have been additional motivations at play, factors related to belief, to symbolism, to a desire to reflect or connect with something perceived as larger than the immediate environment. The idea that ancient builders were encoding knowledge into their structures, whether mathematical, astronomical, or symbolic, is one that continues to be explored, though it remains difficult to separate evidence from interpretation. What is clear is that these structures were not random, that their design involved choices that reflect an understanding of space, proportion, and alignment that was applied consistently enough to create recognizable patterns across different regions. As modern technology allows for more comprehensive mapping and analysis, including satellite imagery and digital modeling, these patterns become more visible, revealing connections that might not be apparent when sites are studied in isolation. Large-scale surveys have shown how certain alignments extend across landscapes, how clusters of sites relate to one another, how the placement of structures may be part of broader systems that are not immediately obvious on the ground. This broader perspective shifts the focus from individual monuments to networks, from isolated achievements to interconnected systems, even if the nature of those connections remains uncertain. It also highlights the role of perception in shaping our understanding, as patterns that were once invisible become apparent when viewed from a different angle or with different tools. The question of whether these patterns represent coincidence or shared knowledge does not have a simple answer, and it may not be a question that can be resolved definitively with the evidence currently available. It is possible that both explanations hold some truth, that certain principles were discovered independently because they are effective, while others may have been transmitted through forms of contact that have not left clear records. It is also possible that our interpretation of these patterns is influenced by our own tendency to seek connections, to impose coherence on complex data, to find meaning in repetition, even when it may arise from multiple sources. This does not diminish the significance of the patterns, but it does remind us to approach them with a balance of curiosity and caution, recognizing both their potential importance and the limits of our understanding. As we consider the global presence of these geometric forms, from circular cities to aligned pyramids to symmetrical layouts, we are invited to think about the ways in which ancient cultures engaged with space, with the environment, and with ideas that may have transcended individual contexts. Whether through observation, experimentation, or shared tradition, they created structures that continue to resonate, not only because of their physical presence, but because of the patterns they reveal, patterns that connect places and times in ways that are not always immediately clear. These patterns do not provide direct answers, but they do open up a space for inquiry, a way of looking at the past that emphasizes relationships rather than isolation, that considers the possibility that there may be underlying principles that link diverse expressions of human creativity. In that space, the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to explore further, to consider the evidence from multiple perspectives, and to remain open to the idea that the past may be more interconnected than it appears. Coincidence, or shared knowledge, we leave behind patterns carved into the earth to a question that ties everything together. When we look back across the fragments we have uncovered, the machine that mapped the heavens, the metal shaped with a precision that feels almost out of place, the stone polished beyond expectation, the cities that appeared and vanished, the landscapes engineered beneath forests, the pyramids layered with intention, the rivers that disappeared, the cities designed in perfect form, the societies that burned and rebuilt, and the worlds constructed beneath the ground. A pattern begins to form that is not tied to any single place, but to something broader, something that challenges the way we understand progress itself. The traditional view of history presents knowledge as a steady ascent, a gradual accumulation of discoveries and improvements, where each generation builds upon the last, moving forward in a line that leads from simplicity to complexity, from primitive tools to advanced technology, from scattered communities to organized civilizations. It is a model that is easy to follow because it creates a clear narrative, a sense of direction, a structure that allows us to place events and innovations in a sequence that feels logical. But the evidence we have explored does not always fit neatly into this model. There are moments where something appears that seems too advanced for its time, too refined, too complete, as if it emerged not from a gradual process, but from a level of understanding that we do not fully see developing around it. The Antikythera mechanism is one such example, a device that encodes complex astronomical cycles in a system of gears so precise that it would not be matched again for many centuries. It suggests not only technical skill, but a depth of knowledge that implies a tradition, a background that has not been preserved in the same way as the object itself. Similarly, the jade masks of the Maya reflect a mastery of material that challenges our assumptions about the tools and methods available, while the bronze helmets demonstrate a level of metallurgical control that seems difficult to reconcile with the limitations we often associate with the ancient world. These examples are not isolated anomalies, but part of a broader pattern, one that includes architectural achievements, environmental engineering, and systems of organization that appear fully formed without the kind of incremental steps we might expect to see leading up to them. This raises a question that is both simple and complex at the same time: whether these achievements represent peaks in a continuous line of development, or whether they are remnants of knowledge that was once more widespread, more integrated, and perhaps lost or fragmented over time. The idea that knowledge can be lost is not new. History provides many examples of libraries destroyed, traditions disrupted, skills forgotten as societies change, migrate, or collapse. The loss of the Library of Alexandria, for instance, is often cited as a moment when vast amounts of information may have disappeared, though the extent of that loss remains a subject of debate. But even without dramatic events, knowledge can fade when the conditions that support it are no longer present, when systems of education break down, when communities that hold specific skills are dispersed, when practices that were once central become less relevant. In such cases, what remains are fragments, objects, structures, and techniques that hint at what was once known, but do not fully explain how that knowledge was acquired or applied. This creates the impression of gaps, of missing links in the chain of progress, where something appears without a clear origin or disappears without a clear continuation. The concept of nonlinear knowledge suggests that progress is not always a straight path, but can involve cycles, periods of advancement followed by decline, moments where knowledge reaches a high level and then diminishes, only to be rediscovered or reinvented later. This does not mean that entire civilizations with advanced technologies existed in the way some speculative theories propose, but it does open the possibility that certain forms of understanding may have been more developed at specific times than the broader historical narrative indicates. For example, the precision of certain ancient constructions, the alignment of structures with celestial events, the creation of materials with specific properties, all point to a level of observation and experimentation that may not have been consistently maintained or recorded. It is possible that these achievements were the result of focused efforts within particular contexts, supported by conditions that allowed for deep exploration, but not sustained across wider regions or longer periods. When those conditions changed, whether due to environmental factors, social shifts, or external pressures, the knowledge associated with them may have been reduced, simplified, or lost. Another aspect to consider is the way knowledge is transmitted. In many ancient cultures, much of what was known was not written down in detailed manuals, but passed through practice, through apprenticeship, through direct experience. This kind of knowledge is often highly effective, but also vulnerable, because it depends on continuity, on the presence of individuals who carry and share it. If that continuity is broken, the knowledge can disappear quickly, leaving behind only the results, which may be difficult to replicate without the same context. This can create the impression that ancient achievements are more mysterious than they were at the time, not because they involved unknown forces, but because the processes behind them are no longer accessible in the same way. The idea of a lost civilization, in the sense of a single, advanced society that predates known history and spreads knowledge across the world, is a more controversial interpretation, one that requires evidence that is currently limited or ambiguous. While there are patterns and similarities across different regions, as we have seen, these can often be explained through a combination of independent development and shared human tendencies, rather than direct connection. However, the presence of these patterns does suggest that there may be underlying principles that were discovered in multiple places, principles related to geometry, astronomy, materials, and organization, that reflect a common human capacity to observe, understand, and apply knowledge in ways that produce similar outcomes. This does not require a single source, but it does point to a level of sophistication that is sometimes underestimated in discussions of the ancient world. The missing links in progress may therefore be less about entire civilizations that have vanished without trace, and more about the incomplete nature of our records, the fact that we are reconstructing the past from fragments, from what has survived, from what we have been able to find and interpret. There may be many aspects of ancient knowledge that have not yet been discovered, buried beneath layers of earth, hidden in environments that have changed or simply overlooked because they do not fit easily into existing frameworks. As new technologies allow us to explore these possibilities, to scan beneath the surface, to analyze materials at a finer scale, to map landscapes in greater detail, we may uncover more pieces of this puzzle, filling in some of the gaps, while perhaps creating new ones. The question of whether knowledge was lost or whether our understanding of it is incomplete is not one that can be answered definitively, but it is one that encourages a different way of thinking about history, one that allows for complexity, for variation, for the possibility that progress is not always a straight line, but a series of movements that can rise, fall, and shift in unexpected ways. It invites us to look at the past not as a simple progression, but as a landscape of ideas and practices that have evolved under different conditions, producing results that sometimes align with our expectations and sometimes challenge them. In this landscape, the anomalies we have encountered are not necessarily exceptions, but indicators, points where our current models may need to be adjusted to account for a wider range of possibilities. The Antikythera mechanism, the Maya craftsmanship, the metallurgical precision, the architectural achievements all become part of a broader conversation about what was known, how it was known, and how that knowledge was preserved or lost over time. They remind us that the past is not fully visible, that there are layers that have yet to be uncovered, and that our understanding is shaped by the evidence we have, as well as by the questions we ask. As we bring these threads together, the distinction between lost knowledge and lost civilization becomes less about choosing one explanation over the other, and more about recognizing that knowledge itself is dynamic, influenced by context, by transmission, by the conditions that support or disrupt it. It may be that what we are seeing is not the remnants of a single lost civilization, but the traces of multiple moments where human understanding reached levels that were later diminished or transformed, leaving behind artifacts that seem out of place because the surrounding context has changed. In this sense, the mystery is not only about what was achieved, but about how those achievements fit into the broader pattern of history, and how we interpret them in light of what we know and what we do not. The idea that knowledge may not be linear does not diminish the accomplishments of the present, but it adds depth to our perspective, suggesting that there are different ways of advancing, different paths that can lead to similar outcomes, and that the past may hold examples of approaches that we have not fully explored or understood. It encourages a sense of curiosity, of openness to the possibility that there is more to learn, not only from what is new, but from what has been left behind, waiting to be rediscovered. We leave behind the idea of lost knowledge to something far more unsettling, because once the patterns begin to connect, once the fragments start to feel less like isolated curiosities and more like pieces of something larger, the question shifts, quietly at first, and then with a weight that is difficult to ignore. It is no longer just about how these things were built, or why they were abandoned, or what techniques were used, but about the framework we are using to understand all of it. For a long time, we have told ourselves a story about the past that is clean and structured, a story where humans begin with simple tools, gradually discover agriculture, form small communities, develop writing, build cities, and eventually create the complex systems we recognize today. It is a story that moves forward, step by step, each stage building on the last, each innovation leading naturally to the next. But what if that story is incomplete? Not entirely wrong, but simplified in a way that smooths over the irregularities, the anomalies, the moments that do not quite fit. What if the past was not a straight path, but something more uneven, with peaks and declines, with periods of understanding that rose higher than we expect and then fell away, leaving behind only traces that seem out of place when viewed through the lens of a linear narrative? When we consider the precision of ancient structures, the complexity of devices like the Antikythera mechanism, the mastery of materials that still challenges modern replication, the existence of large, organized systems in environments once thought incapable of supporting them, the repeated appearance of geometric patterns across distant cultures, it becomes difficult to maintain the idea that ancient humans were simply working at a lower level of capability across all domains. Instead, it suggests that there may have been areas of knowledge, specific fields of understanding, where ancient societies reached levels that were highly refined, even if those levels were not sustained or expanded in the ways we might expect. This does not mean that they had access to the same technologies we have today, but it does raise the possibility that their relationship with certain materials, with observation, with systems, may have been more developed than we often assume. The idea that civilization could restart, that knowledge could be lost and then rediscovered, is not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. History provides smaller examples of this process: technologies forgotten and later reinvented, techniques lost when the conditions that supported them changed, languages that disappear and are only partially reconstructed. If we extend this idea over longer periods, across larger scales, it becomes possible to imagine scenarios where entire systems of knowledge were diminished, not erased completely, but reduced to fragments, to isolated practices that no longer carried the full context of their original use. In such a scenario, what we see in the archaeological record would not be the beginning of knowledge, but a phase of rebuilding, a process of rediscovery that unfolds over time, giving the impression of steady progress, while in reality it may be more cyclical, with moments of insight emerging, fading, and re-emerging in different forms. This perspective does not require a single lost super-civilization, nor does it depend on dramatic, unexplained events, but rather on the recognition that human systems are sensitive to change, that they can expand under certain conditions and contract under others, that knowledge is not guaranteed to accumulate indefinitely, but must be maintained, shared, and supported to persist. The environments we have explored, rivers that shift, climates that change, landscapes that transform, remind us that the context in which knowledge exists is not stable, and that when that context changes, the knowledge itself can be affected. A river dries up, trade routes disappear, communities disperse, and with them, the networks that sustain complex understanding can weaken or break. What remains are the results, the structures, the artifacts, the evidence of what was once possible, but without the full explanation of how it was achieved. This creates a sense of mystery, not because the past is inherently unknowable, but because we are looking at it through gaps, through missing pieces that disrupt the continuity of the story. The question of whether we are rediscovering old science is perhaps the most subtle of all, because it does not present itself as a clear yes or no, but as a possibility that emerges when we notice similarities between ancient achievements and modern rediscoveries. In some cases, techniques that were once used and then forgotten are found again, sometimes through experimentation, sometimes through analysis of ancient artifacts, sometimes through entirely different paths that lead to similar conclusions. This does not imply that ancient knowledge was identical to modern science, but it does suggest that there may be underlying principles that have been approached from different angles at different times, leading to outcomes that resonate across centuries. The idea that certain forms of understanding can be reached, lost, and reached again is consistent with a non-linear view of progress, one that allows for repetition, for variation, for the possibility that the path forward is not always entirely new, but sometimes intersects with paths that were taken before. As we consider these possibilities, it is important to remain grounded, to distinguish between what the evidence supports and what remains speculative, to avoid replacing one simplified narrative with another that is equally rigid. The goal is not to overturn everything we know, but to expand it, to allow for complexity, for nuance, for the recognition that the past may not fit neatly into the frameworks we have constructed. The anomalies we have explored do not necessarily point to a hidden history waiting to be revealed in a single discovery, but to a pattern of questions that invite further investigation, that encourage us to look more closely, to consider alternative explanations, to remain open to the idea that our understanding is still evolving. Standing at the edge of this perspective, looking back across the fragments of the past, there is a sense that we are not just uncovering history, but also examining the way we think about it, the assumptions we bring, the structures we use to organize it. The monuments, the artifacts, the landscapes, they do not change, but our interpretation of them does, shaped by new information, new tools, new ways of asking questions. And in that process, the line between certainty and possibility becomes less fixed, more fluid, allowing for a view of history that is not confined to a single path, but open to multiple trajectories, multiple layers of understanding that can coexist without fully resolving into a single narrative. It is in this space, between what we know and what we are still trying to understand, that the most compelling questions emerge, not as challenges to be quickly answered, but as invitations to think more deeply, to explore more carefully, to recognize that the past may hold more than we have yet seen, not because it is hidden in some distant, inaccessible place, but because it is embedded in the evidence we already have, waiting to be interpreted in new ways. And as the journey comes to a close, as the stories settle and the questions linger, one thought remains, quiet but persistent, not demanding an answer, but offering a perspective that shifts the focus from what was built to what was lost along the way. Maybe the greatest mystery isn't what they built, but why we forgot.